Amidst the dust of 7 hills and the fading echoes of kings, a new idea was born, fragile, defiant, and unprecedented. It did not rise from prophecy or divine decree, but from resistance. In the early light of Rome's awakening, power was no longer to be inherited by blood alone. It would be contested, negotiated, and fought for in the open air of the Forum, beneath the relentless gaze of the people. The Roman Republic was not a nation at peace with itself. It was a living argument between rich and poor, tradition and reform, ambition and restraint. Its history is carved not only in marble and law, but in civil strife, broken oaths, and blood spilled by citizens against citizens. From its earliest days, Rome expanded not because it was united, but because it was relentless, absorbing enemies, allies, and ideas with equal force. Over nearly 5 centuries, the Republic would conquer the Mediterranean, master the art of governance, and invent political concepts that still shape the modern world. Yet in doing so, it sowed the seeds of its own destruction. Victory bred inequality, power eroded restraint, and the very system designed to prevent tyranny would, paradoxically, give rise to it. This is the story of how a city of farmers became the ruler of an empire, and how the republic that made Rome great was ultimately consumed by its own success. Chapter 1. The Fall of Kings. In the dawn of Rome's memory, before marble temples and world-spanning legions, the city was ruled not by laws, but by men, kings. Their authority was ancient, ceremonial, and absolute, rooted in Etruscan tradition, sanctified by religion, and enforced by custom rather than consent. For generations, Romans had known no alternative. Power flowed downward from a single figure, crowned not merely by office, but by fear. By the late 6th century BCE, Rome was no longer a village clinging to the Tiber. It had grown into a restless city of farmers, traders, artisans, and soldiers, people who labored, fought, and paid taxes, yet had little voice in how they were ruled. At the summit of this hierarchy stood Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome. His name would not be remembered for wisdom or restraint, but for excess, arrogance, and force. Tarquinius did not ascend through popular support. He seized power through violence, assassinating his predecessor and ruling without consultation. The Senate, once an advisory body, was sidelined or silenced. Executions replaced debate. Fear replaced tradition. Where earlier kings had balanced authority with custom, Tarquinius ruled as though Rome were his personal possession. His court reflected this transformation. Lavish building projects, heavy taxation, and compulsory labor imposed upon the people to glorify royal ambition. Yet tyranny alone does not end a monarchy. What shattered Rome's tolerance for kingship was not merely political oppression, but moral outrage. The spark came from within the royal household itself. The actions of Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, ignited a crisis that would reverberate far beyond a single family. His crime, an act of personal violence against a noblewoman, was not just an individual transgression. It became a symbol of what unchecked power allowed men to do. In Roman memory, this moment was preserved not as scandal, but as revelation. It exposed a system where authority could not be challenged, where justice bent before status, and where victims had no recourse but despair. When the truth emerged, outrage spread rapidly, not whispered but spoken aloud. In homes, in marketplaces, and among the ranks of the army, anger hardened into resolve. Leading this reckoning were men of Rome's elite, figures who had benefited from the monarchy yet now recognized its danger. They did not speak of reform, they spoke of removal. What followed was not a spontaneous riot, but a coordinated rejection of kingship itself. The royal family was expelled. The gates were closed behind them. No foreign army marched on Rome. No palace was stormed. Instead, a collective decision was made. Rome would never again be ruled by a king. The year, remembered as 509 BCE, marked more than the end of a dynasty. It marked a psychological rupture. Kingship was no longer seen as sacred or necessary. It was seen as a threat. The very word rex became synonymous with arrogance and abuse. From this trauma emerged Rome's defining political instinct: suspicion of concentrated power. But Rome did not descend into chaos. In the vacuum left by the king, the Romans did something unprecedented. They did not elevate another ruler. They divided authority. Power was split between two annually elected magistrates, consuls, each able to restrain the other. No office would be permanent. No command would be absolute. Every role would be temporary, accountable, and shared. This was not democracy in the modern sense. Power still rested with the elite, but it was a radical departure from monarchy. Governance became a system rather than a person. Authority became conditional rather than inherited. And crucially, the memory of the king's expulsion was institutionalized. Every year, Rome reenacted its founding rejection through elections, ceremonies, and laws designed to prevent any one man from rising too high. Fear was now a political tool, but a constructive one. The fear of tyranny shaped every decision. Magistrates were limited in time and scope. Religious and civic offices were separated. Emergency powers existed, but only temporarily, and only in moments of existential threat. Rome built a state designed not on trust, but on restraint. The Republic was born from rejection, not optimism. It did not assume virtue, it anticipated ambition. It did not rely on good men. It relied on systems to contain them. And in this mistrust lay both its greatest strength and its future vulnerability. For in casting out its kings, Rome had declared war not only on monarchy, but on the very idea of unchecked power, a war it would fight for centuries, even as that power slowly found new forms. In the immediate aftermath of the monarchy's collapse, Rome stood at a crossroads. The king was gone, but kingship itself still lingered like a ghost, an idea that could return if left unchecked. The early republic understood this danger instinctively. What had been overthrown by outrage now had to be prevented by design. And so, Rome began constructing a political system shaped not by idealism, but by fear. Fear sharpened into law. The new order did not emerge overnight. It was assembled piece by piece, each institution a reaction to the excesses of the past. At its center stood the consulship, two men elected annually, holding equal authority. Each could block the other's decisions. Each knew his power would expire in months, not years. Time itself became a restraint. No consul could rule long enough to entrench himself, no matter how ambitious or popular. This principle, collegiality, became sacred. Power was never entrusted to one individual when it could be divided. Magistracies multiplied. Religious authority was separated from political command. Legal judgment was dispersed across assemblies and councils. Where the king had once embodied Rome, the Republic fractured authority deliberately, ensuring that governance could never again wear a single face. Yet this architecture was fragile. Rome was still a city of deep inequality, dominated by a narrow aristocracy. The Senate, composed of former magistrates, emerged as the Republic's guiding force, not by law, but by influence. It advised, debated, and coordinated policy, shaping the state through tradition rather than decree. Its authority rested on prestige and memory, not formal power. This too was intentional. Written commands could be abused. Unwritten norms relied on restraint. The Roman elite believed that virtue, mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors, would guide behavior. Honor, reputation, and public shame were expected to regulate ambition. Politics became a performance of restraint, where overt hunger for power was viewed with suspicion. To desire kingship openly was not merely illegal, it was dishonorable. Still, the Republic was not naive. It recognized that emergencies demanded decisive action. Thus emerged the dictatorship, an office that embodied Rome's paradox. In moments of existential threat, one man could be granted absolute authority, but only for a strictly limited time. 6 months, no extensions, no debate. When the crisis ended, power was to be relinquished voluntarily. The dictator was a reminder that Rome understood necessity, but feared permanence even more. This system reflected a profound tension at the heart of the Republic. Romans believed power was dangerous, yet unavoidable. Authority could save the state, but it could also destroy it. The solution was not to eliminate power, but to cage it, surround it with limits, rituals, and expiration dates. The memory of Tarquinius Superbus haunted every office holder. To be accused of regal ambition, adfectatio regni, was a political death sentence. Such accusations did not require proof. Suspicion alone could ruin careers. The Republic weaponized its own trauma, using fear of monarchy as a tool to enforce conformity and restraint. But fear has consequences. As Rome stabilized internally, its gaze turned outward. Wars against neighboring peoples resumed, fought now not in the name of a king, but in defense of the Republic. Victories brought prestige to commanders, and with prestige came influence. Triumphs paraded generals through the city, celebrated by the people and sanctioned by the Senate. These rituals honored success, but they also flirted dangerously with hero worship. The Republic tried to contain this as well. Generals laid down their commands at the city's edge. Armies were forbidden to enter Rome. Military authority stopped at the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city. Once inside, a commander became a civilian again, subject to law, debate, and judgment. This separation between military and civic power was one of the Republic's most critical safeguards. It acknowledged a truth Rome had learned early. Armed loyalty was the fastest path back to kingship. As long as soldiers obeyed the state rather than individuals, the Republic believed itself safe. Yet beneath these safeguards lay unresolved tension. The Republic had replaced kingship with competition between offices, families, and ambitions. Elections became battlegrounds of reputation. Political life demanded constant visibility, achievement, and rivalry. Power was limited, but ambition was not extinguished. It was redirected. The Republic survived because it balanced fear with opportunity. Men could rise, but only temporarily. Glory was permitted, but not permanence. Authority was allowed, but never ownership of the state. Rome had built a political machine designed to function on mistrust, rotating elites, and collective memory. And for a time, it worked. But embedded within this system was a contradiction that would grow with Rome itself. As the Republic expanded, the scale of power increased, but its safeguards remained designed for a city, not an empire. What restrained ambition in a small state would one day strain under the weight of conquest. For now, however, Rome believed it had solved the problem of kings. It had turned fear into structure, trauma into tradition, and rejection into identity. Yet history would test whether fear alone could hold back men who learned how to master the system itself. From the ashes of monarchy, Rome did not emerge renewed by harmony, but hardened by caution. The early republic was not built on confidence in human virtue. It was constructed around the assumption that power corrupts. Every law, every office, every ritual carried the imprint of a collective vow. Never again would Rome bow to a king. This vow became the Republic's silent constitution. Generations passed, yet the trauma of expulsion remained alive in memory and ceremony. Each year, consuls swore oaths not to rule as kings. Each magistrate walked a narrow line between authority and suspicion. Success was celebrated but never trusted. The Republic taught its citizens to admire power only briefly and to dismantle it quickly. This mindset shaped Roman political culture in profound ways. Public life became a theater of restraint. Leaders spoke the language of service, not dominance. Ambition had to be disguised as duty. Even the most powerful men claimed reluctance, portraying office as burden rather than prize. To desire authority openly was to invite ruin. The Republic did not eliminate ambition. It forced it into subtlety. Yet beneath this disciplined exterior, tension simmered. The system favored a narrow aristocracy whose names echoed across generations. Though kings were gone, elite families still monopolized influence, wealth, and office. The Republic promised liberty from monarchy, not equality among citizens. Power rotated, but within a closed circle. This contradiction was tolerated because the Republic delivered stability. It provided predictability where monarchy had offered fear. Laws replaced whim. Offices expired. Decisions were debated rather than decreed. Rome's people accepted inequality in exchange for security, believing that the absence of kings meant the presence of freedom. But freedom, as Rome defined it, was fragile. It depended on collective restraint, on men choosing not to exploit loopholes, not to stretch traditions, not to place themselves above the state. For centuries, custom held where law could not. Shame was stronger than punishment. Reputation mattered more than force. This was the Republic's quiet strength and its hidden weakness. As Rome grew, its political culture was exported along with its armies. Conquered peoples were bound to Rome not by crowns but by treaties, citizenship rights, and legal frameworks. The Republic expanded through inclusion rather than annihilation, offering a share in its system to those willing to submit to it. This approach transformed enemies into allies, swelling Rome's manpower and reach. Yet expansion also amplified inequality. War enriched some and impoverished others. Victory concentrated wealth in the hands of those who commanded armies and governed provinces. The Republic's safeguards, designed for a city-state, strained to contain the rewards of empire. Power remained temporary in theory, but its consequences became permanent in practice. The fear of kingship endured, but it evolved. Tyranny was no longer imagined solely as a man wearing a crown. It became associated with influence, popularity, and extraordinary success. Romans learned to fear not just monarchs, but anyone who became indispensable. This paranoia preserved liberty, but it also fostered instability. The Republic became a state in permanent vigilance against itself. And yet, for nearly 5 centuries, it endured. It endured because its founders understood a truth many civilizations ignored. Systems matter more than intentions. Rome did not rely on perfect leaders. It assumed flawed men and built constraints around them. This realism allowed the Republic to survive crises that would have shattered less cautious states. But realism has limits. Fear can restrain ambition, but it cannot extinguish it. Over time, the Republic's mechanisms became tools to be manipulated rather than safeguards to be respected. Laws meant to limit power could be bent by those who mastered procedure. Offices meant to rotate could be monopolized through influence. Traditions meant to inspire restraint could be invoked selectively. The Republic did not fall because it forgot its hatred of kings. It fell because it clung to it too rigidly, failing to recognize new forms of domination when they emerged. Still, in its earliest centuries, Rome believed it had escaped the ancient cycle of monarchy and collapse. It believed it had created something enduring, something rational, something stronger than any crown, a state governed by law, memory, and mutual suspicion. Thus began Rome's great experiment, a republic born from rejection, sustained by fear, and destined to reshape the world before it could no longer contain itself. And as Rome turned outward to secure its survival, a new struggle emerged within its walls, between those who ruled and those who bore the weight of the Republic's victories. Chapter 2. Patricians and Plebeians, verse E. In the early years of the Roman Republic, liberty was proclaimed, but not shared equally. The kings were gone, yet power did not fall into the hands of the people. It settled instead among a narrow circle of ancient families, the Patricians, whose lineage, wealth, and religious authority placed them above the rest of Roman society. The Republic had rejected monarchy, but it had not dismantled hierarchy. Below the Patricians stood the Plebeians, the vast majority of Rome's population, farmers, craftsmen, traders, laborers, and soldiers. They worked the land, filled the ranks of the legions, and sustained the city's economy. In war, they bled for Rome. In peace, they paid its taxes. Yet politically, they were voiceless. They could not hold high office. They were excluded from priesthoods. They had no access to the highest courts. The republic that promised freedom had created two Romes living side by side, unequal before the law. This imbalance was not accidental. Patrician dominance rested on tradition and control of institutions. The Senate, though technically advisory, was composed almost entirely of patricians. Magistracies were monopolized by the same families year after year. Even the law itself was unwritten, interpreted by patrician judges who claimed exclusive knowledge of custom and procedure. Justice, like power, flowed downward. For the plebeians, the cost of this system was crushing. Military service was mandatory yet unpaid. Small farmers were often absent from their fields for years at a time, fighting Rome's wars while their land fell into neglect. When they returned, many found themselves forced to borrow money to survive, often from patrician creditors. Debt laws were harsh. Failure to repay could result in enslavement. Roman citizens, bound in chains, worked the land of other Romans. This contradiction lay at the heart of the early republic, a state that proclaimed liberty while permitting bondage within its own citizen body. Resentment grew slowly, then all at once. It did not erupt in violence, but in refusal. The plebeians discovered the one leverage they possessed, their absence. Without soldiers, Rome could not fight. Without laborers, the city could not function. And so, in the early 5th century BCE, the plebeians withdrew from the city entirely, abandoning Rome in what history would remember as the first secession of the plebs. It was a silent rebellion. No weapons, no bloodshed, just emptiness. The patricians were stunned. The republic, so carefully constructed, was suddenly exposed as fragile. Without the plebeians, there was no army, no economy, no future. Faced with collapse, the elite were forced to negotiate. For the first time, power conceded something, not out of generosity, but necessity. From this crisis emerged one of the most consequential innovations in Roman political history, the tribunate. The tribunes of the plebs were officials elected solely by plebeians sworn to defend their interests against abuse. Their bodies were declared sacrosanct. To harm a tribune was a crime punishable by death. Even more revolutionary was their power of veto, the ability to block decisions, laws, and actions they deemed harmful to the people. This was not equality. Patricians still dominated the republic. But it was recognition, acknowledgement that the state could not function without addressing internal injustice. The conflict of the orders had begun. It was not a single revolt, but a centuries-long struggle, marked by strikes, protests, legal battles, and political brinkmanship. Each confrontation followed a familiar pattern: plebeian resistance, elite fear, and gradual concession. The republic bent, but did not break. Over time, access widened. Plebeians gained the right to elect their own officials. Intermarriage between patricians and plebeians was legalized, weakening the rigid boundaries of class. Magistracies once reserved for the elite slowly opened to men of non-patrician birth. These victories were incremental, often contested bitterly, but they accumulated into structural change. Perhaps most transformative was the demand for written law. Plebeians understood that as long as justice remained unwritten, it could be manipulated. Their pressure forced the creation of Rome's first public legal code, the 12 Tables, etched into stone and displayed for all to see. Law was no longer the private language of the elite. It became a shared reference point, limiting arbitrariness and abuse. Yet even as reforms advanced, inequality endured. Wealth remained concentrated. Social mobility was limited. Political culture still favored the powerful. The Republic did not erase class. It managed it. What made Rome exceptional was not that it was fair, but that it was flexible. Unlike many ancient states, it allowed sustained internal conflict without descending into permanent chaos. Protest did not automatically mean treason. Reform did not require revolution. The Republic absorbed pressure, adjusted, and continued. This internal tension between patricians and plebeians, privilege and participation, became a defining feature of Roman identity. It taught Rome how to negotiate power internally, even as it prepared to project power outward. But compromise has consequences. As the Republic expanded and its stakes grew higher, the balance between elite control and popular pressure would be tested again and again under far more dangerous circumstances. The conflict of the orders did not move forward in dramatic leaps. It advanced through endurance. Decade after decade, plebeians pressed their demands not with swords, but with persistence. Each concession extracted from the patrician elite was hard-won, fragile, and often resisted with quiet hostility. Rome's internal struggle was not a civil war. It was a war of pressure, patience, and precedent. After the creation of the tribunate, the plebeians had gained a shield, but not yet a seat at the center of power. Tribunes could block injustice, but they could not propose laws binding on the entire republic. Their authority was reactive, not creative. Patrician magistrates still controlled legislation, courts, and command. The balance remained uneven. Yet the tribunate changed the rhythm of Roman politics. For the first time, elite decisions faced immediate resistance. A consul could no longer act without considering the reaction of the people's representatives. The veto, simple, absolute, and disruptive, became the plebeians' most powerful weapon. It forced negotiation where once there had been command. The struggle intensified around the issue of law. Unwritten custom favored those who interpreted it. Patrician judges claimed authority over legal procedure, often manipulating ambiguity to their advantage. For plebeians, justice remained unpredictable, subject to status rather than principle. The demand for transparency grew louder. Eventually, pressure reached a breaking point. A special commission was appointed to codify Roman law. The result was the 12 Tables, Rome's first written legal code. Displayed publicly, they defined rights, obligations, and penalties in plain view of the people. Though far from egalitarian, the tables transformed Roman society. Law became a fixed reference, not a private weapon. Even magistrates were now bound by written limits. This moment marked a psychological shift. The plebeians had not merely protested, they had reshaped the Republic's foundation. Law, once controlled by lineage, was now anchored in public knowledge. Justice, though still imperfect, became more predictable. Power, though unequal, was less arbitrary. But reforms did not end exploitation. Debt remained a relentless force. Small farmers continued to struggle under the weight of loans accumulated during military service. Land ownership concentrated steadily in the hands of wealthy elites who purchased or seized properties from indebted citizens. Economic inequality deepened even as political rights expanded. Once again, the plebeians resisted, not through violence, but withdrawal. Secessions repeated. Each time the message was the same. Rome could not function without its people. Each time concessions followed. Debt laws were softened. Protections expanded. The Republic survived not by suppressing dissent, but by absorbing it. Perhaps the most symbolic breakthrough came with access to high office. Over time, laws were passed allowing plebeians to hold magistracies previously reserved for patricians. The consulship itself, the highest executive office, was eventually opened. This did not dismantle aristocracy, but it transformed it. A new elite emerged, The nobles, families whose status came not from birth alone, but from service and office. Rome had not become equal, but it had become permeable. This permeability proved vital. It allowed talent to rise from below, refreshing leadership and stabilizing the state. Ambition found pathways within the system rather than against it. The Republic learned how to channel social tension into institutional change. Yet this success carried a cost. As plebeian leaders gained power, they did not abolish hierarchy. They joined it. Many became indistinguishable from the patricians they once opposed. The language of reform persisted, but the substance narrowed. Class conflict softened into elite competition, fought now within the halls of power rather than outside them. The Republic's genius lay in this transformation. It turned social struggle into political structure. Protest became procedure. Resistance became office. Rome learned to evolve without overthrowing itself. But evolution is not resolution. Economic inequality persisted. The countryside hollowed as land accumulated into large estates. The urban poor grew in number. Political rights expanded faster than material security. The Republic had learned how to manage conflict, but not how to eliminate its causes. Still, for centuries, this system held. The conflict of the orders ended not with victory or defeat, but with absorption. Patricians and plebeians became interwoven into a single ruling class, bound by shared interests and competition. The Republic emerged more flexible, more resilient, and more complex than before. This internal struggle taught Rome how to compromise without surrender, how to reform without collapse. It forged habits of negotiation that would serve the Republic as it turned outward, confronting enemies beyond Italy. Yet the lessons learned here about power, pressure, and concession would later be weaponized in far more dangerous ways. For Rome had discovered something profound, that mass pressure could bend institutions, and one day ambitious men would learn how to wield that pressure for themselves. By the middle centuries of the Republic, the bitter divide that once threatened to tear Rome apart had not vanished, but it had been transformed. Patricians and plebeians no longer stood on opposite sides of an unbridgeable gulf. Instead, they were locked into a tense coexistence, governed by compromise, memory, and precedent. The conflict of the orders, once a struggle for survival, had evolved into a defining mechanism of Roman political life. The Republic now bore the marks of its internal struggle. Its institutions were layered, complex, and deliberately slow. Laws required debate. Decisions invited resistance. Authority was dispersed across assemblies, magistracies, and councils, each checking the others. This was not inefficiency. It was design. Rome had learned that speed favored tyranny, and unity without restraint invited abuse. The plebeians had gained representation, protection, and access. Tribunes stood between the people and the state, wielding the veto as a shield against excess. Magistracies were no longer closed by birth alone. Law was written, visible, and increasingly standardized. These were not small victories. They reshaped Rome's political identity and distinguished the Republic from the monarchies that surrounded it. Yet beneath these achievements, the social reality remained uneven. Wealth continued to concentrate. Political access expanded, but economic security did not keep pace. Many plebeians gained voice, but not land. They could vote, protest, and veto, but they still struggled to survive. Rome had addressed the symptoms of inequality more effectively than its causes. This imbalance was tolerated because the Republic delivered something rare in the ancient world: adaptability. Where other states crushed dissent or fractured under it, Rome absorbed pressure and reformed itself incrementally. The plebeians did not overthrow the Republic, they reshaped it from within. Their resistance strengthened institutions rather than destroying them. This adaptability became Rome's internal advantage. It allowed the Republic to mobilize vast populations without provoking constant rebellion. Citizens, even when disadvantaged, believed they had a stake in the system. That belief translated into loyalty, especially in war. And war was constant. As Rome expanded across Italy, it demanded ever more soldiers. The legions were filled not with mercenaries, but with citizens, many of them plebeians, who fought knowing that their service carried political meaning. Military duty and civic identity became inseparable. To fight for Rome was not merely to obey, it was to participate. This bond between the people and the state proved decisive. Rome's armies endured setbacks that would have shattered other powers, yet returned stronger. The Republic's internal compromises produced external resilience. Citizens who felt heard were willing to sacrifice. Inclusion, however imperfect, fueled expansion. But the cost of this expansion was borne unevenly. Long campaigns removed plebeian farmers from their land. Victories enriched generals and elites through spoils, contracts, and conquered territory. The rural backbone of the Republic weakened as estates grew larger and small holdings disappeared. The urban population swelled with displaced citizens seeking work, protection, and political leverage. The Republic's earlier reforms had given these citizens tools, assemblies, tribunes, collective action. What had once been defensive instruments could now be used aggressively. Mass pressure, once aimed at justice, could be turned toward advantage. The people had learned their power, and power, once discovered, does not remain passive. Still, Rome believed its system could contain these forces. It trusted tradition to guide ambition, procedure to temper emotion, and memory to restrain excess. For centuries, this confidence was justified. The Republic endured crises that would have ended less flexible states. But success bred strain. The same mechanisms that allowed reform also enabled manipulation. Popular support could elevate men rapidly. Vetoes could paralyze governance. Assemblies could be swayed by rhetoric rather than reason. The line between representation and populism grew thinner with each generation. The conflict of the orders had taught Rome how to negotiate power between classes. It had not taught it how to manage power on a larger stage. In resolving its earliest internal struggle, the Republic had created habits that would shape its future, both its resilience and its vulnerability. It had proven that reform need not mean collapse, but it had also demonstrated that institutions respond to pressure, not principle alone. This lesson would not be forgotten. As Rome's territory expanded and its victories multiplied, new tensions would emerge, no longer between patricians and plebeians, but between wealth and poverty, city and countryside, ambition and restraint. The old struggle had been absorbed, but its logic remained. And as the Republic turned outward to confront rival powers, the balance forged within its walls would be tested under pressures far greater than class conflict alone. For Rome had learned how to bend without breaking, but it had yet to learn how much bending its republic could endure. Chapter 3. Laws written in stone. In the early Roman Republic, justice did not yet belong to the people. It belonged to memory. Law lived not in texts or records, but in the minds of a few men who claimed authority through tradition. These men, drawn almost exclusively from patrician families, served as judges, priests, and magistrates. They interpreted custom as they saw fit, invoking ancestral practice, mos maiorum, to justify decisions that often favored their own class. To the plebeian majority, justice was not predictable. It was personal, negotiable, and often cruel. This ambiguity was power. In disputes over land, debt, marriage, or punishment, outcomes depended less on facts than on status. A patrician creditor could demand repayment without mercy. A plebeian debtor could be chained, sold, or forced into servitude under laws he had never seen and could not challenge. Even when magistrates claimed to act within tradition, that tradition remained invisible. spoken aloud only by those who controlled it. As Rome expanded and its social tensions deepened, this system became increasingly intolerable. The plebeians had secured representation through tribunes and assemblies, but these victories rang hollow when justice itself remained inaccessible. What good was political voice if the law could still be twisted behind closed doors? Gradually, the demand shifted. It was no longer only about office or protection. It was about certainty. The call for written law grew louder in the forum, in the assemblies, and during moments of crisis. Plebeians argued that no republic could survive if its rules were known only to the few. Without transparency, there could be no equality before the law, only obedience to it. What they demanded was radical for its time. That law be fixed, visible, and binding on all citizens, regardless of birth. The patrician elite resisted fiercely. Written law threatened flexibility, discretion, and privilege. It would expose custom to scrutiny and strip magistrates of interpretive monopoly. To commit law to writing was to accept limits, and limits were dangerous to those accustomed to authority. The standoff persisted for years, simmering beneath the surface of Roman politics. Eventually, pressure overcame resistance. Rome could not continue as a republic while its legal foundation remained unwritten. The legitimacy of the state itself was at stake. In response, an extraordinary step was taken. A special commission of 10 men, the decemviri, was appointed to draft a public code of laws. Normal magistracies were suspended. Power was concentrated temporarily, not to rule, but to define the rules by which all would be ruled. It was a moment of trust and risk. The decemvirs were tasked with something unprecedented in Roman history: to translate custom into text, to turn memory into stone. They examined existing practices, consulted traditions, and reportedly studied foreign legal systems, including those of the Greek world. Their mandate was not to create equality, but clarity. What emerged was stark, severe, and unambiguous. The 12 tables, as they came to be known, were engraved and displayed publicly, most likely in the forum where any citizen could see them. For the first time, Roman law stood outside the control of individual magistrates. It was no longer whispered or selectively remembered. It was visible, permanent, and inescapable. The content of the tables reflected the values and anxieties of early Rome. They governed property boundaries, inheritance, marriage, debt, and punishment. They defined legal procedure down to exact wording. They prescribed penalties that were harsh by any standard, especially toward debtors and the poor. But they did something revolutionary. They set limits. Magistrates could no longer invent procedure on the spot. Creditors could no longer claim hidden rights. Citizens now knew what the law demanded and what it allowed. Justice remained unequal in outcome, but it became equal in form. This distinction mattered deeply. For the plebeians, the 12 tables were not a victory of compassion, but of predictability. They did not soften the law, they stabilized it. In a society accustomed to arbitrary authority, stability itself was liberation. Knowing the rules meant knowing where power ended. For the Republic, the impact was transformative. Law was no longer a personal extension of elite will. It became an institution. Authority shifted subtly, but decisively away from individuals and toward structure. Rome reinforced its defining belief that order, not kings, sustained society. Yet the story of the 12 tables did not end in harmony. The concentration of power in the hands of the decemvirs tested the very principles the Republic sought to protect. What began as a legal mission soon revealed the dangers of unchecked authority, even in the name of reform. For Rome was about to relearn a lesson it thought it had mastered: that law must restrain power, not replace it. The appointment of the decemviri was meant to be temporary, controlled, and self-limiting. Rome had entrusted 10 men with extraordinary authority not to rule but to record, to translate custom into permanence and then step aside. For a republic born from fear of kings, this was a dangerous concession, yet necessity outweighed caution. Without written law, Rome's internal fractures would only deepen. In the first year, the experiment appeared successful. The initial set of laws was drafted, debated, and displayed. Public confidence grew. The decemvirs were praised for clarity and restraint. Encouraged by this progress, the Republic extended their mandate for a second year to complete the work. It was during this second year that Rome's confidence began to unravel. The decemvirs no longer acted as custodians of law, but as its masters. Normal magistracies remained suspended. There were no consuls to check authority, no tribunes to veto abuse. Appeals were silenced. What had been justified as a legal necessity hardened into political dominance. The Republic had seen this pattern before. As the decemvirs consolidated control, their behavior changed. Judgments became arbitrary. Power was exercised without accountability. The very absence of written limits which the 12 tables were meant to end returned in a new form. Law existed, but those enforcing it stood above it. The crisis reached its breaking point through a familiar Roman catalyst: moral outrage. A case involving a young plebeian woman exposed the corruption of the regime. A decemvir attempted to manipulate the law itself to justify personal abuse, twisting legal procedure to claim ownership over a citizen. The act echoed the crimes that had brought down the monarchy generations earlier. Rome recognized the pattern immediately. Much crowds gathered. Anger spread. The memory of kings returned, not as history, but as warning. Once again, the plebeians withdrew. Soldiers refused orders. Assemblies defied authority. The Republic's most powerful weapon, collective absence, was deployed against those who claimed to serve the law. Faced with unified resistance, the decemvirs fell. Some were exiled. Others took their own lives. Their rule ended not through assassination or foreign invasion, but through civic rejection. The 12 tables survived. This distinction mattered deeply. Rome did not abandon written law because of its misuse. Instead, it reaffirmed a crucial principle: law must be separated from absolute power. The failure of the decemvirs did not discredit the legal code. It validated it. The problem was not law itself, but who controlled it. With the restoration of traditional magistracies, the Republic reasserted its balance. Tribunes returned. Appeals were reinstated. Most importantly, the 12 tables were preserved as foundational law, immune to manipulation by any single authority. Their presence reshaped Roman life in subtle but lasting ways. Legal procedure became formalized. Citizens learned specific phrases required to bring cases. Courts followed defined steps. Rights and obligations were no longer fluid. Even when outcomes favored the powerful, the process itself was now visible and contestable. This transparency fostered a new kind of civic awareness. Romans began to think of themselves not merely as subjects of authority, but as participants in a legal order. The 12 tables also reinforced social norms. They reflected a harsh, disciplined society, one that valued property, hierarchy, and patriarchal control. Fathers held near absolute authority within families. Punishments were severe. Debt remained unforgiving. But these norms were no longer hidden behind elite discretion. They were declared openly, inviting debate and gradual reform. Over time, interpretation became as important as inscription. Magistrates, jurists, and advocates learned to work within the text, arguing meaning, precedent, and application. Roman law became a living system, capable of evolution without losing continuity. This adaptability would prove decisive as Rome expanded beyond Italy. The Republic had taken a critical step forward. It had anchored justice not in men, but in words carved into stone. Authority was still unequal, but it was now constrained by reference to something beyond individual will. In doing so, Rome laid the groundwork for one of its most enduring legacies. Law, became Rome's true empire. Not enforced solely by legions, but by procedure, precedent, and participation. It was a system that could be extended, taught, and adapted across cultures and generations. Long after kings, consuls, and even emperors faded, Roman law would continue to shape how societies understood justice, rights, and governance. But in the moment, Rome was still a city struggling to survive. The 12 Tables did not bring peace. They brought structure, and structure, while stabilizing, also revealed new tensions between written order and lived reality. As Rome turned outward, engaging in constant warfare, the application of law would be tested under pressure far beyond the Forum. For the Republic had learned how to write its rules. Now it would have to enforce them across a city, a people, and soon, an expanding world. With the fall of the decemvirs, the Roman Republic emerged bruised, but wiser. Once again, it had confronted a familiar danger, the concentration of power in the hands of a few. And once again, it had responded not by abandoning its institutions, but by refining them. The 12 Tables remained not as symbols of tyranny, but as evidence that law itself could survive misuse, so long as no one stood above it. In the years that followed, the presence of written law began to reshape Roman society at every level. Disputes were no longer settled solely by influence or lineage, but by reference. Citizens learned the language of the law. Legal phrases became part of everyday speech. Even those who could not read understood that the rules existed and that they were fixed. This shift altered how Romans perceived authority. Magistrates still held power, but that power was now bounded by visible limits. A consul or judge could interpret the law, but not invent it. Even the most elite families were subject to procedures they could not openly ignore. The Republic had not achieved equality, but it had achieved accountability. The 12 Tables also reinforced Rome's collective identity. They did not merely regulate behavior, they taught values. They emphasized discipline, responsibility, hierarchy, and respect for property. They reflected a society that prized order above compassion, stability above flexibility. In doing so, they bound citizens together through shared expectations, even when those expectations were harsh. Over time, the rigidity of the tables invited reinterpretation. As circumstances changed, Romans learned to work around their severity rather than erase them. Legal innovation came not through replacement but through commentary, precedent, and custom layered atop the original code. This approach preserved continuity while allowing adaptation, a balance that would become a hallmark of Roman governance. Most importantly, written law strengthened trust in institutions. The Republic no longer relied solely on tradition or fear of shame. It relied on procedure. This allowed Rome to manage conflict without constant violence. Disputes could be argued, grievances could be voiced. Outcomes could be contested within the system rather than against it. This legal culture proved invaluable as Rome expanded. Conquered peoples encountered not just soldiers, but courts. Roman law offered predictability, contracts, and recognized status. It became a tool of integration, extending Rome's influence more subtly than force alone ever could. Citizenship, rights, and obligations followed legal definitions rather than personal favor. In this way, the 12 Tables marked a turning point not only for Rome, but for history itself. They represented one of humanity's earliest attempts to bind power with principle, to replace arbitrary rule with structured order. Though primitive by modern standards, their impact was profound and enduring. A.D. Chattel, yet law, like all human creations, carried contradictions. The same code that limited elite abuse also codified inequality. The same transparency that empowered citizens also normalized harsh punishment. The Republic's faith in law sometimes masked injustice behind procedure. Romans learned to obey the letter of the law, even when its spirit was cruel. This tension would never fully resolve. Still, the achievement stood. Rome had proven that a state could survive without kings, governed instead by shared rules. Law became the republic's backbone, its memory, its conscience, and its shield against tyranny. Centuries later, as the republic fractured under the weight of empire, ambitious men would claim to defend these very laws, even as they dismantled the system that sustained them. The 12 tables would be invoked, interpreted, and revered long after their original context had faded. They would outlive the republic itself. From courts in medieval Europe to modern legal systems across the world, echoes of Rome's earliest laws would endure, proof that ideas carved into stone can travel further than armies and last longer than crowns. For in rejecting kings, Rome had bound itself to law. And as the Republic turned from internal order to external conquest, it would soon discover that law, like power, grows more complex the further it is stretched. Beyond the forum and into the fields of battle, Rome now carried its rules with it, into a world that would test whether order alone could sustain an empire. Chapter 4. A City at War. Rome did not awaken one morning with dreams of empire. There was no grand vision of conquest, no prophecy promising dominion over distant lands. In its earliest centuries, Rome fought because it had to. Survival, not destiny, shaped its path. Hemmed in by rivals, surrounded by wary neighbors, and vulnerable to sudden attack, the young republic existed in a state of permanent readiness. Peace was rare, brief, and fragile. War was familiar. The geography of central Italy offered little protection. Open plains invited invasion. Hills provided only partial refuge. The Tiber connected Rome to trade, but also to danger. Latin towns watched Rome with suspicion. Etruscan cities to the north remembered their lost influence. Mountain tribes descended without warning. Every border was uncertain. Every harvest season risked interruption by violence. In this environment, Rome became a society of soldiers. Military service was not a profession. It was a civic obligation. The Republic did not rely on mercenaries or standing armies. It relied on its citizens. Farmers left their fields, craftsmen set down their tools, and ordinary men assembled when the call was sounded. To fight was to belong. To refuse was to stand outside the community. This expectation forged a distinct Roman identity. Citizenship and military duty became inseparable. Rights were earned through service. Honor was measured not by wealth alone, but by willingness to defend the state. The Republic was defended by men who had a personal stake in its survival, because its fall would be their ruin. Early Roman warfare was brutal, local, and repetitive. Campaigns were seasonal, dictated by agriculture rather than strategy. Battles were fought close to home, often against familiar enemies. Victory meant security for another year. Defeat meant vulnerability. Through these conflicts, Rome learned quickly. Defeat was studied, not excused. Tactics evolved, equipment standardized, discipline tightened. Roman armies became known not for brilliance, but for resilience. They adapted where others clung to tradition. Equally important was how Rome treated the defeated. Unlike many ancient states, Rome did not seek annihilation. Conquered communities were rarely erased. Instead, they were absorbed. Former enemies were bound to Rome through treaties, obligations, and varying degrees of citizenship. They provided soldiers, labor, and loyalty in exchange for protection and participation in Rome's system. This strategy transformed war into expansion without constant rebellion. Rome did not rule Italy as a foreign occupier. It integrated it. Allies fought alongside Roman citizens. Shared victories created shared identity. Over time, Rome's military strength multiplied not through extermination, but inclusion. Yet inclusion came at a price. The burden of war fell disproportionately on the lower classes. Plebeian farmers served repeatedly, leaving their land unattended. Long absences led to debt, foreclosure, and displacement. While elites financed campaigns and gained prestige, smallholders bore the physical cost. Victory enriched the state, but its rewards were unevenly distributed. This imbalance began to shape Roman politics. Military success became a currency. Triumphs elevated reputations. Generals gained influence. The Republic celebrated victory publicly, parading commanders through the city in elaborate rituals. These triumphs were meant to honor the state, but they also glorified individuals. For the first time, military achievement began to intersect dangerously with personal ambition. Rome's institutions attempted to contain this. Commands were temporary. Armies disbanded after campaigns. Generals returned to civilian life. The separation between soldier and citizen remained a core principle. But the seeds of change had been planted. As Rome fought more wars, commands grew longer. Territories expanded. Victories became more consequential. The Republic was becoming accustomed to war, not as an emergency but as a condition of existence. This constant mobilization reshaped Roman society. Discipline, hierarchy, and obedience, qualities honed in battle, filtered into political life. Debate increasingly gave way to decisiveness. Prestige flowed toward those who proved themselves under arms. Rome remained a republic, but it was a republic hardened by conflict. And yet, for now, the system held. Citizen armies still answered to the state. Victory still belonged to Rome, not to any one man. Expansion across Italy brought security, manpower, and confidence. The Republic believed it had found a sustainable balance between warfare and governance. But war has momentum. Each victory created new borders to defend. Each conquest introduced new enemies. Each alliance expanded obligations. Rome was no longer merely reacting to threats. It was inheriting them. The city that once fought to survive was now fighting to maintain what it had taken. And as Rome's reach extended beyond its original horizons, the demands of war would grow heavier, longer, and more complex, testing whether a citizen republic could endure a future defined by perpetual conflict. As Rome's campaigns multiplied, war ceased to be an occasional burden and became the Republic's defining rhythm. The seasons of sowing and harvest were now matched by seasons of marching and battle. Year after year, legions assembled, not for a single decisive struggle, but for a continuous series of confrontations that pushed Rome's boundaries ever outward across Italy. These wars were not glorious epics. They were grinding, methodical, and unforgiving. Rome fought village by village, hill by hill, against peoples who knew the land better and often struck without warning. Victory was rarely swift. Defeat was never final. What distinguished Rome was not brilliance, but endurance. When other states faltered after loss, Rome returned again and again, rebuilding its armies and adapting its methods. Through this repetition, Roman military culture hardened. The legion evolved from a loosely organized force into a disciplined system built on structure and flexibility. Units were arranged to rotate in battle, allowing exhausted soldiers to withdraw and fresh men to advance. Discipline was enforced relentlessly. Cowardice was punished. Obedience was demanded. Yet this severity was balanced by a powerful incentive, shared reward. Soldiers fought not as expendable tools, but as stakeholders in Rome's success. Equally transformative was Rome's approach to command. Leaders were not hereditary warlords. They were elected magistrates temporarily entrusted with military authority. Their legitimacy derived not from lineage but from office. In theory, this ensured accountability. In practice, it created a new dynamic, one in which political ambition and military success became increasingly intertwined. A successful campaign elevated a man's standing in the Republic. It brought honor, influence, and the gratitude of soldiers and allies alike. The line between service to the state and advancement of the self began to blur. Rome's expansion across Italy followed a consistent pattern. Defeated enemies were offered terms rather than annihilation. Some received partial citizenship, others alliance status. All were bound by obligation to provide troops when called upon. Rome did not merely conquer land. It constructed a network of dependent communities, each tied to the Republic through law and military service. This system transformed Rome's wars. The Republic's armies grew larger with each victory, not smaller. Former enemies now marched under Roman command. Italy became a reservoir of manpower unmatched by any rival. Rome's strength no longer lay in a single city, but in a federation forged through conflict. Yet this success masked growing strain. As campaigns lengthened and distances increased, the old rhythms of citizen-soldier life began to fracture. Men were gone for years rather than months. Farms deteriorated. Families struggled. The traditional balance, short service followed by return to civilian life, became harder to maintain. War was no longer an interruption to life. It was life. Within Rome, the political consequences became visible. Military experience became a prerequisite for authority. Veterans returned with expectations of reward, land, and recognition. Assemblies listened more closely to men who had led in battle. The voice of the soldier grew louder in civic life. At the same time, commanders learned the power of loyalty. Soldiers fought beside the same leaders year after year. Bonds formed, not just between comrades, but between army and general. Gratitude, admiration, and shared hardship created personal allegiance that extended beyond the battlefield. The Republic still believed it controlled its armies. Commands remained temporary. Triumphs were granted by the Senate. Generals were expected to lay down authority at the city's edge. These rituals reinforced the idea that victory belonged to Rome, not individuals. But reality was shifting. The scale of warfare had outgrown the simplicity of early safeguards. Rome was becoming a state defined by permanent mobilization. Its identity, once rooted in law and civic balance, was now inseparable from military success. Honor flowed from conquest. Prestige followed victory. The Republic had learned how to win wars, but not yet how to limit their influence on politics. And yet, the system continued to function. Italy was secured. External threats diminished. Rome stood unrivaled among its neighbors. What had begun as defensive necessity had become strategic dominance. The Republic believed this dominance was sustainable, protected by institutions, tradition, and restraint. But war leaves no institution untouched. The habits forged on campaign, decisiveness, hierarchy, loyalty to leaders, began to reshape expectations within the state. Politics grew sharper, more competitive, more personal. Success in war became the most visible measure of worth. Rome had transformed itself through conquest. It had absorbed enemies, refined discipline, and built a military machine unrivaled in the ancient world. But beneath this strength lay unresolved questions. How long could a republic of citizens remain free when its survival depended on constant war? How could ambition be restrained in a system that rewarded victory so generously? These questions lingered, unanswered, as Rome prepared to face challenges beyond Italy, conflicts that would test not only its armies, but the very foundations of its political order. By the time Rome secured dominance over the Italian peninsula, the Republic had been transformed by the very conflicts it had survived. The city that once fought to protect its fields and walls now commanded a vast network of allies and subject communities. Rome stood at the center of Italy not as a conqueror ruling through terror, but as an arbiter of power sustained by obligation, military service, and law. Yet beneath this stability lay a deeper change, one that would shape the Republic's future in ways its founders could not have foreseen. War had become Rome's defining institution. The citizen soldier, once the embodiment of civic virtue, now faced a harsher reality. Campaigns stretched longer, frontiers moved farther from home, Service demanded years, not seasons. For many plebeians, military duty no longer coexisted with stable civilian life. Land was lost, debts accumulated, families struggled in absence, the rewards of victory flowed upward, while the costs were borne below. This imbalance altered the social fabric of the Republic. Veterans returned with scars, experience, and expectations, but often without property or security. Their loyalty to Rome remained strong, but it was increasingly shaped by personal relationships forged during war. Generals who had shared hardship and victory commanded respect that extended beyond office. The Republic had created leaders whose authority was not merely political, but emotional. Public rituals reflected this shift. Triumphs grew more elaborate. Crowds cheered commanders as embodiments of Rome's strength. Names associated with victory gained weight in assemblies and elections. Though institutions remained intact, influence began to flow toward those who had proven themselves in war. Rome had not abandoned its fear of kingship, but it had begun to admire power in new forms. At the same time, the inclusive strategy that fueled expansion continued to pay dividends. Allies supplied troops, roads connected territories. Rome's military system became an engine of integration. Italy was no longer a patchwork of rival states. It was a unified force bound by shared service. This unity allowed Rome to face external threats with unmatched resilience. Yet unity also magnified the stakes of internal competition. As Rome's wars grew larger, commands grew more prestigious. Military success became the clearest path to political dominance. Ambition found its most effective expression on the battlefield. The Republic still rotated offices, still enforced term limits, but the consequences of victory now lingered far longer than any magistracy. The founders had designed institutions to prevent kings. They had not anticipated generals whose influence could outlast office without wearing a crown. And still, Rome believed it remained in control. The Republic's confidence rested on tradition, precedent, and memory. It trusted that no man would dare openly challenge the system that had rejected monarchy so violently. It trusted that law and custom would restrain ambition, as they always had. For now, this confidence seemed justified. Rome was secure. Italy was unified. The Republic had survived internal conflict and external threat alike. War had made it strong, disciplined, adaptable, relentless. Its armies were feared, its alliances endured, its institutions functioned. But strength has momentum. Each conquest increased Rome's obligations. Each victory expanded its frontiers. Each success demanded further defense. The Republic was no longer reacting to danger. It was managing dominance, and dominance requires constant enforcement. The costs would soon escalate beyond Italy. As Rome turned its attention outward, toward great powers across the seas, the scale of war would expand beyond anything the Republic had known. Campaigns would last decades, armies would fight far from home, wealth would flow in unprecedented quantities, and the relationship between soldier, commander, and state would shift irreversibly. The city that had learned to survive through war was now poised to become something else entirely. Rome had mastered the art of conquest. But conquest, once unleashed, does not remain a tool, it becomes a force. And as the Republic stepped onto the wider stage of the Mediterranean, it carried with it a question forged in blood and discipline. Could a state built on citizen soldiers endure an age of endless war without losing its soul? Chapter 5. The Punic Crucible. Beneath the wide skies of the western Mediterranean, two powers rose on opposite shores, each forged by trade, war, and ambition. Rome ruled the land. Carthage ruled the sea. For centuries they had coexisted at a distance, bound by treaties and mutual calculation. But as Rome's influence spread across Italy, that distance collapsed. Inevitably, the paths of the Republic and Carthage converged, and where they met, compromise gave way to conflict. Carthage was everything Rome was not: wealthy, ancient, and maritime. It commanded trade routes that stretched from Iberia to North Africa. Its power flowed from ships, silver, and commerce rather than citizen armies. Carthage fought with hired soldiers, mercenaries drawn from across the Mediterranean, while its elite governed from afar. Rome watched this model with suspicion. It saw wealth without shared sacrifice, power without civic duty. The spark that ignited war came from Sicily, a fractured island caught between empires. Control of its ports meant dominance of Mediterranean trade. When Roman forces crossed the sea for the first time, they did so not as conquerors, but as reluctant participants drawn into a struggle they could no longer avoid. The First Punic War was unlike anything Rome had known. The Republic, master of land warfare, faced an enemy whose strength lay on the water. Rome had no fleet to match Carthage's naval supremacy. What it had instead was determination. Ship by ship, Rome built a navy from nothing, copying enemy designs, training crews with relentless discipline, and compensating for inexperience with innovation. Losses were staggering. Storms destroyed fleets. Battles ended in disaster. Thousands drowned. Yet Rome did not retreat. Each defeat was followed by renewed effort. New ships replaced wreckage. New crews replaced the dead. The Republic learned at terrible cost, driven by a single conviction: surrender was unthinkable. After more than 2 decades of war, Rome prevailed. Carthage sued for peace, ceding Sicily and paying heavy tribute. Rome had won its first overseas war, and in doing so, it had crossed a threshold. The Republic was no longer confined to Italy. It now held territory beyond the peninsula, governed by officials far from the oversight of the Senate and assemblies. This victory altered Rome's trajectory irreversibly. The spoils of war flowed into the city: silver, slaves, land. Wealth accumulated rapidly but unevenly. Elites invested in large estates. Small farmers struggled to compete. Veterans returned to find their livelihoods threatened by economic forces unleashed by conquest. The Republic had gained territory, but it had also introduced imbalance. Peace with Carthage did not last. A generation later, the conflict resumed on a far more terrifying scale. Carthage, humiliated but not broken, sought revival through expansion in Iberia. There, a new figure emerged, one whose name would become synonymous with Rome's greatest fear. Hannibal Barca did not seek incremental advantage. He sought annihilation. When war came again, Hannibal struck where Rome least expected, over land, not sea. Leading an army across the Alps, he brought war directly into Italy. It was an act of audacity unmatched in Roman memory. The Republic was unprepared for the devastation that followed. Battle after battle ended in catastrophe. Roman armies were outmaneuvered, encircled, destroyed. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and most devastatingly at Cannae, entire legions were wiped out. Tens of thousands of citizens lay dead. The heart of the Republic bled openly. Allies defected. Panic spread. For the first time in centuries, Rome faced the possibility of extinction. Yet Rome did not surrender. There was no single moment of salvation, no brilliant reversal. What followed was something more grim and more characteristic: endurance. The Republic refused to negotiate. It raised new armies from the remnants of society: young men, old men, even former slaves. Fields went untended. Resources were exhausted. But Rome fought on. Strategy shifted. Rather than seek decisive battle, Roman commanders avoided direct confrontation, harassing Hannibal's forces, cutting supply lines, waiting. It was a war of attrition against a general who thrived on decisive victory. Slowly, painfully, the balance shifted. Rome's strength was not genius. It was refusal. Years passed. Hannibal remained undefeated on Italian soil, yet increasingly isolated. Meanwhile, Roman forces carried the war elsewhere, to Spain, to Africa. The conflict widened, stretching Carthage's resources thin. At last, Rome forced its enemy to defend its own homeland. The crucible was not yet complete, for the struggle with Carthage would not only decide control of the Mediterranean, it would decide what kind of power Rome would become. As the war ground on, the Italian peninsula became a landscape of exhaustion and fear. Hannibal's army moved like a shadow across Rome's allies, striking swiftly, vanishing before retaliation could arrive. Fields were burned, towns defected or were destroyed. The Republic's authority, so carefully built over generations, wavered under the pressure of survival. Yet Rome's response revealed something deeper than tactical adaptation. It revealed a political will hardened by centuries of struggle. After the disaster at Cannae, no negotiations were opened, no emissaries were sent to beg for peace. The Senate forbade even the discussion of surrender. In a moment that defined Roman identity for centuries, the Republic chose collective sacrifice over compromise. Ransom for captured soldiers was refused. The dead were mourned, but the living were ordered back to duty. Rome mobilized everything it had. Teenagers were conscripted. Elderly men were pressed into service. Criminals and debtors were offered redemption through arms. Even enslaved men were promised freedom in exchange for loyalty on the battlefield. Gold was stripped from temples. Private wealth was requisitioned. The Republic no longer pretended this was a limited war. It was a fight for existence. At the heart of this effort stood an ensign with strategy. Roman commanders avoided the open-field battles Hannibal sought. Instead, they shadowed him, disrupted his supplies, and denied him the decisive confrontation he needed to force Rome's collapse. This cautious approach was deeply unpopular at first. Romans were accustomed to direct action, not restraint, but necessity reshaped tradition. The war stretched on, year after brutal year. Hannibal remained undefeated, yet increasingly constrained. His victories could not be converted into political collapse. Rome's core allies held firm. The city itself remained defiant. The Republic endured losses that would have shattered any rival power and continued to fight. While Hannibal was pinned in Italy, Rome carried the war elsewhere. In Iberia, Roman forces targeted Carthaginian holdings, cutting off resources and recruitment. These campaigns were costly and uncertain, but they chipped away at Carthage's strength. Slowly, the balance began to shift. A new generation of commanders emerged from this prolonged conflict, men shaped by relentless warfare rather than seasonal campaigns. Among them was Publius Cornelius Scipio, whose rise signaled a transformation in Roman military leadership. He studied his enemy, adopted flexible tactics, and pursued victory beyond Italy's borders. Rome's decision to invade North Africa forced Carthage into a defensive war for the first time. Hannibal was recalled from Italy to protect his homeland. After years of devastation on Roman soil, the war's center of gravity shifted decisively. The final confrontation came near Carthage itself. There, Rome's endurance met Carthage's desperation. The battle was not merely a clash of armies, it was the culmination of a generational struggle. Rome prevailed. With defeat came submission. Carthage was stripped of its empire, its fleet reduced, its independence constrained. Rome emerged as the dominant power of the Western Mediterranean. But victory came with consequences that could not be undone. The war had transformed the Republic. It had demanded levels of mobilization, discipline, and sacrifice unprecedented in Roman history. The state had learned to command vast resources and populations over long distances. It had discovered the power of sustained war and the costs of it. Wealth flowed into Rome in torrents. Spoils, tribute, and new provinces enriched the elite. Senators and equestrians invested in land seized from the defeated. Large estates expanded, worked by enslaved labor captured in war. Meanwhile, many small farmers, absent for years of service, returned to find themselves displaced and indebted. The social balance that had once sustained the Republic began to tilt. War had rewarded endurance, but it had also widened inequality. Those who commanded and financed campaigns prospered. Those who fought them struggled to recover. The citizen soldier, once the backbone of the Republic, found himself increasingly marginalized in peacetime. Politically, the impact was equally profound. Military success became the highest form of legitimacy. Commanders who delivered victory commanded loyalty, gratitude, and influence. The Republic still rotated offices, but the reputations forged in the Punic Wars endured long after terms expired. Rome had survived its greatest external threat, but in doing so, it had crossed a threshold. It was no longer merely a republic defending itself. It was an empire in all but name, commanding territories, wealth, and armies far beyond its original design. The crucible had forged strength, but it had also revealed fractures. And those fractures would deepen as Rome learned that dominance brings not peace, but new pressures, internal as much as external. When the last echoes of the Punic Wars faded, Rome stood transformed. The Republic had entered the conflict as a regional power bound to Italy. It emerged as the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Carthage, once Rome's equal, once its greatest fear, was reduced to submission, its fleets broken, its ambitions contained. No rival remained capable of challenging Roman authority on the same scale. Yet triumph did not bring closure. It brought acceleration. The Republic now governed territories it had never intended to rule. Sicily, Sardinia, parts of Iberia, and vast swaths of influence lay beyond the peninsula, administered by magistrates operating far from Rome's immediate oversight. These provinces were not integrated as Italy had been. They were exploited, sources of tribute, grain, and wealth flowing steadily toward the capital. For Rome's elite, the rewards were immense. Senators and equestrians invested heavily in provincial ventures. War spoils financed grand estates and political careers. Enslaved populations captured during decades of fighting flooded the labor market, reshaping agriculture. Large estates expanded rapidly, worked by captive labor rather than citizens. Profit replaced subsistence. Scale replaced tradition. For the Republic's lower classes, the aftermath was harsher. Thousands of veterans returned from years, sometimes decades, of service to find their farms absorbed by wealthy neighbors or rendered uncompetitive. Grain from overseas provinces undercut local production. Rural communities hollowed out as displaced citizens drifted toward Rome in search of survival. The city swelled with men who had fought for the Republic and now struggled to live within it. This was not an immediate collapse, but it was a shift. The social equilibrium that had sustained the citizen-soldier ideal began to erode. Military service no longer guaranteed stability. Sacrifice no longer promised security. The Republic had been built on the assumption that those who defended it would also sustain it economically. The Punic Wars shattered that balance. Politically, the consequences were just as profound. The scale of warfare had elevated military command to unprecedented importance. Generals who delivered victory commanded loyalty far beyond their formal authority. Soldiers remembered who had led them, fed them, rewarded them. Reputation, once confined to the city, now echoed across provinces and armies. The Republic's institutions remained intact. Consuls were elected, laws debated, offices rotated. But beneath these forms, influence concentrated, prestige hardened into power. Military success became the clearest path to political dominance. Rome had always feared kings. Now it faced something more subtle, individuals whose authority grew not from crowns, but from gratitude, loyalty, and fame. The Republic's safeguards had been designed to prevent hereditary monarchy, not to restrain commanders forged by decades of continuous war. The Punic Wars had also altered Rome's relationship with violence. Sacrifice on a massive scale had become normalized. Losses that would once have ended wars were now absorbed as necessary. The Republic had learned to endure catastrophe without surrender, but endurance came at the cost of sensitivity. Human life became a resource, counted and replenished. This hardening shaped Roman identity going forward. War was no longer a threat to be avoided. It was a condition to be managed. Expansion promised security, wealth, and prestige. Each conquest created new frontiers, new obligations, and new enemies. The Republic moved forward not because it sought endless war, but because retreat was now impossible. Rome's victory over Carthage marked the beginning of Mediterranean dominance, but also the end of innocence. The Republic had crossed from survival to supremacy. Its institutions, designed for a city-state of farmers and soldiers, now bore the weight of empire. Law, citizenship, and tradition strained under demands they had never been meant to carry. And yet, Rome believed itself prepared. It had survived kings, class conflict, and annihilation. It trusted its resilience. It trusted its customs. It trusted that the lessons learned in the Punic crucible, discipline, endurance, sacrifice, would guide it safely into the future. But the crucible had not only tested Rome, it had reshaped it. The Republic that emerged from the Punic Wars was wealthier, stronger, and more confident than ever before. It was also more unequal, more militarized, and more dependent on extraordinary individuals. The balance that once held patricians and plebeians together now bent beneath the weight of empire. The triumph over Carthage was Rome's greatest victory and its most dangerous turning point. For the Republic had proven it could survive any enemy. What it had not yet learned was whether it could survive itself. And as Rome turned eastward toward new rivals and richer prizes, the consequences of its greatest war would follow into every province, every assembly, and every ambition yet to come. Chapter 6. Empire Without a Crown. In the aftermath of the Punic crucible, Rome stood unrivaled but uncertain. The Republic had defeated its greatest external enemy and emerged with territories stretching far beyond the Italian peninsula. From the silver-rich lands of Iberia to the fertile plains of Sicily, from the mountain passes of Gaul to the culturally ancient cities of Greece, Roman authority now reached across seas and civilizations. Yet Rome did not call itself an empire. It still spoke the language of the Republic. Its leaders still wore the masks of tradition. Power expanded, but identity did not. This contradiction lay at the heart of Rome's next transformation. The institutions that governed Rome had been designed for a city-state, a community where magistrates were visible, accountable, and temporary. But provinces were distant. Communication was slow. Oversight was weak. Authority, once carefully divided within Rome, became concentrated abroad. Governors ruled provinces for years at a time with minimal supervision, commanding armies, collecting taxes, and dispensing justice far from the eyes of the Senate or the people. In theory, these men were servants of the Republic. In practice, they became masters of vast territories. Provincial command brought unprecedented opportunity. Governors controlled taxation, contracts, and legal judgments. Wealth flowed into their hands through tribute, exploitation, and private arrangements. The boundaries between public duty and personal profit blurred rapidly. Corruption was no longer an aberration. It was a feature of imperial distance. The Senate attempted to govern this expanding world through decrees and tradition, but its reach fell short of its ambition. Senators debated policy in Rome, while realities unfolded thousands of miles away. Laws written for Italy proved inadequate for provinces with different cultures, economies, and histories. Roman authority existed, but justice often did not. This strain eroded the moral foundations of the Republic. Earlier generations had prized simplicity, discipline, and service to the state. Now wealth from conquest flooded Rome. Luxury goods from the East, silks, spices, art, and silver, redefined status. Political competition intensified. Office was no longer merely a civic duty. It was a gateway to enrichment and influence. The old ideals of moderation began to fade beneath displays of excess. Rome had always rewarded success, but now success meant domination abroad. Generals returning from provinces arrived not only with spoils, but with reputations that dwarfed those of traditional magistrates. They had commanded armies, governed cities, negotiated with kings. Their experience placed them beyond the scale of ordinary politics. Soldiers remember them not as temporary officials, but as leaders who had delivered victory, land, and reward. The Republic still insisted that no man was indispensable. Reality disagreed. The empire without a crown depended increasingly on individuals whose authority extended beyond legal limits. The Senate relied on successful commanders to manage distant crises it could not control directly. Exceptional commands became routine. Temporary authority stretched into years. Emergency powers were granted not because the Republic was collapsing, but because it had grown too large to manage otherwise. With each concession, precedent weakened. Rome had conquered the world, but it had not conquered the problem of power. Its political imagination lagged behind its territorial reach. The Republic still feared kings, yet it empowered men who ruled like monarchs abroad, without the title, without the restraint, and without the accountability that Rome's founders had once insisted upon. At home, the consequences accumulated quietly. Elections became more competitive, more expensive, more dependent on wealth gained overseas. Political alliances shifted around military success rather than civic virtue. Debate hardened into rivalry. The language of service gave way to the language of achievement. The Republic was still standing, but it was changing in ways its traditions could no longer fully explain. Rome ruled an empire while denying the word itself. It governed provinces through institutions never meant to bear such weight. It trusted old customs to restrain new powers, and for a time this denial sustained the illusion of continuity. But denial has limits. As Rome's dominion expanded further east and west, the strain on its institutions would intensify. Corruption would deepen. Competition would sharpen. Authority would concentrate where oversight could not reach. The empire without a crown was not a solution. It was a transition. And transitions, once begun, rarely stop where their architects intend. As Rome's borders stretched across seas and continents, distance became its quiet adversary. Messages that once took days now took months. Decisions made in the Senate chamber arrived too late to shape events already concluded on distant frontiers. The Republic had built its authority on proximity, on visibility, debate, and annual accountability. Empire dissolved all three. Provincial governors operated in this vacuum. Armed with imperium and supported by legions loyal to their command, they exercised power with little immediate restraint. In theory, a governor's term was limited. In practice, extensions were common, justified by unfinished wars or unstable regions. The longer a man governed, the more independent he became. His court replaced Rome. His word replaced law. His army replaced the state. Abuse followed predictably. Taxation was farmed out to private contractors who extracted as much as possible, enriching themselves and their patrons in Rome. Local populations were squeezed, their grievances unheard. Courts favored Roman interests. Justice became transactional. While the Republic spoke of order, the provinces experienced extraction. Back in Rome, awareness of these abuses grew, but remedies lagged. Senators were often complicit. sharing profits through business partnerships and patronage networks. Attempts at reform collided with entrenched interests. Trials for extortion occurred, but convictions were rare. The Republic's moral authority eroded as its economic dependence on conquest deepened. This erosion reshaped political culture. Competition for office intensified as stakes rose. Magistracies promised access to provincial command, and provincial command promised wealth beyond any Italian estate. Elections became spectacles of spending and persuasion. Candidates relied on loans, favors, and promises that could only be repaid through future power. Ambition, once moderated by tradition, now demanded returns. The social consequences were visible everywhere. Luxury replaced austerity as a marker of success. Public banquets grew extravagant. Private villas multiplied. Art and philosophy from the Greek world flooded Roman society, admired and imitated, but also feared for their perceived moral softness. Older Romans lamented the loss of simplicity, even as they benefited from empire's rewards. The Senate itself changed in character. Once a council of elders guiding a city-state, it became a clearinghouse for imperial administration, overburdened, reactive, and divided. Factions formed around powerful men rather than shared principles. Policy followed personalities. Debate hardened into rivalry. The Republic's center of gravity shifted from institutions to individuals. Meanwhile, the army evolved alongside empire. Campaigns were longer, farther, and more demanding. Soldiers spent years under the same commanders, forging bonds of loyalty that outlasted office. Pay, plunder, and promises of land tied men to leaders who could deliver, not to a distant senate they would never see. Rome had always feared armies loyal to individuals. Now, it depended on them. The contradiction deepened with each crisis. When threats arose in Spain, Greece, or the East, the Senate turned to proven commanders, men with experience, reputation, and loyal troops. Exceptional commands became normalized. Authority accumulated in fewer hands, justified as necessity. Each exception weakened the rule. Yet the Republic reassured itself with form. Elections continued, laws were passed, magistracies rotated, rituals preserved the appearance of continuity. Rome insisted it remained a republic because it still spoke the language of one. But power was no longer evenly distributed, nor was it easily recalled. As the empire expanded, the gap between Rome's ideals and its realities widened. The Republic had mastered conquest, but not governance at scale. It had inherited diverse peoples and lands without constructing institutions to rule them fairly. The result was a system that functioned through improvisation, influence, and force. And still, Rome moved forward. Success reinforced belief. Wealth masked decay. Victories distracted from imbalance. The Republic had always survived by adapting, by bending without breaking. Many believed this was simply another phase, another challenge to be managed by tradition and resilience. They underestimated the cost of distance. For every province governed far from Rome loosened the bonds of accountability. Every general entrusted with exceptional power set a precedent. Every compromise made in the name of necessity normalized concentration of authority. The empire without a crown was not collapsing, but it was drifting. And drift, in a system built on balance, is dangerous. As Rome pressed onward into the Eastern Mediterranean, into wealthier, older, and more complex societies, the demands on its leaders would intensify. The Republic would face not only enemies abroad, but choices at home that tested whether its fear of kings could survive the realities of empire. By the late 2nd century BCE, the contradiction at the heart of the Roman Republic could no longer be ignored. Rome ruled vast territories, commanded immense wealth, and maintained armies across 3 continents. Yet it continued to govern itself as though it were still a city among rivals. The language of the Republic endured, but its reality had changed beyond recognition. Power now lived far from Rome. Provincial governors exercised authority that would have been unthinkable within Italy. They negotiated with kings, founded cities, levied taxes, and commanded armies for years at a time. Their decisions shaped the lives of millions who had no voice in Roman assemblies. When their terms ended, many returned to Rome wealthy, influential, and shielded by networks of patronage. Accountability, once immediate and public, became distant and rare. This distance reshaped ambition itself. A new political logic emerged, one that measured success not by service within the city, but by achievement abroad. Glory was earned in conquest, wealth was gathered in provinces, loyalty was built through command. The path to dominance no longer ran through debate in the forum alone, but through years of military leadership beyond Rome's borders. The Senate struggled to assert control over this reality. It issued decrees, assigned commands, and passed laws meant to curb excess. Yet enforcement depended on the very men whose power it sought to restrain. When governors were tried for corruption, juries drawn from elite circles hesitated to condemn their peers. Justice bent under shared interest. The Republic had created an empire without creating an imperial conscience. Meanwhile, the army's role continued to expand. Soldiers served longer terms, fought farther from home, and relied increasingly on their commanders for reward and protection. Land grants and spoils promised by generals mattered more than abstract loyalty to the state. The soldier's bond with Rome weakened as his bond with his leaders strengthened. This shift was subtle, but decisive. Rome had once feared a single man commanding the loyalty of armed citizens. Now it had normalized precisely that condition, so long as the man claimed to act in the Republic's name. The title of king was still despised. The reality of kingship was quietly tolerated when it wore the mask of necessity. At home, the consequences accumulated. Political competition grew sharper and more personal. Elections became contests of influence, backed by wealth gained overseas. Alliances formed around powerful figures rather than shared ideals. The Republic's institutions remained, but their authority depended increasingly on consensus that could no longer be assumed. Culturally, Rome changed as well. Exposure to the Greek world reshaped education, art, and philosophy. This enrichment was real, but it also intensified anxieties about identity and decline. Older Romans lamented the erosion of ancestral values, even as they adopted the luxuries and ideas of empire. Moral critique became a constant refrain, yet rarely translated into structural reform. The Republic had conquered civilizations older and more sophisticated than itself. In doing so, it absorbed their complexity without building systems to manage it. Governance became reactive rather than deliberate. Crisis followed crisis, each resolved through exceptional authority rather than institutional renewal. This pattern would prove fatal. Rome's founders had built a state designed to prevent tyranny through balance, rotation, and mistrust of power. Empire undermined each of these safeguards. Balance eroded as authority concentrated abroad. Rotation lost meaning as commands extended indefinitely. Mistrust weakened as success excused excess. And yet, Rome still believed itself protected by tradition. It had survived kings, class conflict, and existential war. It trusted its resilience. It trusted that no one would dare openly seize supreme power. It trusted that fear of monarchy remained embedded too deeply in Roman identity to be overcome. But history does not always announce its turning points. The Republic's transformation was gradual, disguised by continuity. Offices still bore familiar names, laws were still passed, rituals still honored ancient victories. But beneath these forms, the logic of power had changed. Rome now depended on individuals to manage an empire its institutions could not govern alone, and individuals, once empowered, rarely surrender influence voluntarily. The empire without a crown had reached its limit, not in collapse, but in contradiction. Rome had mastered conquest but not restraint. It had built authority without accountability. It ruled the world while denying itself the language to explain what it had become. The Republic stood at a threshold. Ahead lay reform or domination by force. The choice would not be made in theory, but through conflict, ambition, and blood. For the pressures unleashed by empire demanded resolution, and Rome's political imagination was about to be tested beyond its capacity to adapt. As wealth, armies, and ambition converged within the Republic's fragile frame, the next struggle would no longer be between Rome and its enemies, but between Rome and itself. Chapter 7. Reform and Resistance. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the Roman Republic was wealthy beyond precedent and fractured beneath the surface. Victory had delivered empire, but empire had distorted the foundations on which the Republic had been built. The citizen-soldier ideal was eroding. Small farmers vanished from the countryside. Land accumulated into vast estates worked by enslaved labor. Rome's streets filled with displaced citizens who possessed political rights but lacked economic security. This imbalance was not abstract. It was visible, tangible, and corrosive. The Republic's strength had once rested on a broad base of land-owning citizens who could fight, vote, and sustain themselves. That base was collapsing. Military service now removed men from their farms for years at a time. When they returned, many found their land gone, sold under pressure or absorbed by wealthy neighbors who could afford to wait. The spoils of empire flowed upward. The costs pooled below. Rome still called itself a republic of citizens. Increasingly, that claim rang hollow. Into this crisis stepped Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, a tribune of the plebs, descended from nobility, educated and keenly aware of the Republic's contradictions. He was not an outsider. He was part of Rome's elite. But unlike many of his peers, he saw inequality not merely as injustice, but as existential danger. Tiberius believed the Republic was consuming itself. Ancient laws limiting land ownership still existed, ignored for generations. Tiberius sought to revive them, not to punish the wealthy, but to restore balance. His proposal aimed to redistribute public land illegally occupied by elites and resettle dispossessed citizens as small farmers. This was not radical redistribution. It was an attempt to enforce existing law and rebuild the class that had once sustained Rome's armies. To Tiberius, reform was preservation. To the Senate, it was threat. Land was wealth, land was power, and the men who controlled it dominated Rome's political life. Tiberius bypassed the Senate and took his proposal directly to the popular assembly. In doing so, he followed legal procedure, but violated custom. The Senate's authority rested on tradition. Circumventing it struck at the heart of elite control. Resistance was immediate and fierce. A fellow tribune attempted to veto the proposal. Tiberius responded by having him removed from office, an unprecedented act that shattered norms of mutual restraint. Supporters cheered, opponents recoiled. What had begun as legal reform slid rapidly toward confrontation. The land law passed. But the victory was fragile. Tiberius sought re-election as tribune, a move legal but taboo. Annual rotation of office was a cornerstone of Republican restraint. Seeking consecutive terms triggered fear of personal power. Accusations of tyranny followed swiftly. The language of reform collided with the Republic's deepest anxiety, the return of kingship in another form. The confrontation reached its climax in violence. During an assembly, senators and their supporters armed themselves with clubs and stones. They stormed the forum. Tiberius Gracchus was beaten to death along with hundreds of his followers. Their bodies were thrown into the Tiber without burial, an act meant not only to punish, but to erase. Rome had crossed a line. Political conflict, once contained within law and protest, had spilled openly into bloodshed. The Forum, long a place of debate, became a battleground. The Senate justified the killing as defense of the Republic, but the precedent was unmistakable. Force had triumphed over law. The aftermath did not restore calm. Instead, it exposed a republic no longer capable of resolving its deepest problems through consensus alone. Reform had been attempted and answered with violence. The lesson was absorbed by all sides. Power would no longer be negotiated solely through institutions. It could be seized. A decade later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, would return to the same unresolved crisis, armed with greater vision, broader reforms, and deeper popular support. He would also face fiercer resistance. The Republic stood at a dangerous crossroads. It had acknowledged inequality but rejected correction. It had defended tradition but violated its own restraint. The question was no longer whether reform was necessary, but whether the Republic could survive the attempt. For Rome had proven something terrifying. Its laws could be overridden. And once violence entered politics, it rarely left quietly. The death of Tiberius Gracchus did not resolve the Republic's crisis. It silenced a man, not the forces he had exposed. Inequality remained. Displacement continued. Veterans still returned to a city that had no place for them. The Senate had defended its authority through violence, but authority won by blood is rarely secure. In the years that followed, Rome existed in uneasy suspension. The Land Commission created by Tiberius continued its work in diminished form, redistributing some plots, settling some citizens. But without political protection, its momentum slowed. Elite resistance hardened. Reform was tolerated only so long as it did not threaten the foundations of power. The Republic had chosen suppression over solution. Into this unresolved landscape stepped Gaius Sempronius Gracchus, younger brother of Tiberius. He was more eloquent, more strategic, and more comprehensive in vision. Where Tiberius had focused narrowly on land, Gaius sought systemic change. He understood that inequality was not rooted in land alone, but in the structure of Roman power itself. Elected tribune in 123 BCE, Gaius moved swiftly. His reforms targeted multiple pressure points at once. He expanded land redistribution. He introduced subsidized grain for Rome's poor, ensuring food security for the urban population. He reformed military service, shifting the cost of equipment from soldiers to the state, recognizing that the Republic depended on men it had long neglected. Most controversially, Gaius challenged senatorial monopoly over justice. He transferred control of corruption courts from senators to the equestrian class, striking directly at elite impunity. For the first time, governors could be tried by juries not drawn from their own peers. This was not merely reform, it was rebalancing. Gaius also proposed extending Roman citizenship to Rome's Italian allies. These communities had fought Rome's wars, paid its costs, and upheld its power, yet remained excluded from its political life. To Gaius, this exclusion was dangerous. A republic built on loyalty could not deny recognition indefinitely. The reaction was immediate and hostile. The Senate perceived Gaius not as a reformer, but as a revolutionary. His popularity terrified the elite. His proposals threatened entrenched interests on every front: land, justice, citizenship, and economic privilege. The Republic's ruling class responded not with compromise, but countermeasures. For the first time, the Senate deployed a new weapon, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree. It declared that the state was in danger and authorized magistrates to use any means necessary to restore order. Law was suspended in the name of preserving law. The streets of Rome became tense and volatile. Rival assemblies clashed. Supporters armed themselves. The political process fractured into camps defined by loyalty rather than legality. Debate no longer sought persuasion. It sought dominance. Gaius, isolated and hunted, fled the city. On the Aventine Hill, his followers made a final stand. Violence followed swiftly. Hundreds were killed. Gaius Gracchus, cornered and defeated, chose death rather than capture. His body, like his brothers, was denied honor. Chianti. Once again, Rome answered reform with blood. The consequences were devastating. The Republic had not merely failed to enact reform. It had normalized political violence. The Senate had sanctioned lethal force against citizens without trial. The precedent was now explicit. When institutions failed, power would be decided by strength. This moment marked a moral rupture deeper than any before. The Gracchi had attempted to use the Republic's laws to save the Republic. Their failure sent a chilling message to future generations. Legality was fragile, reform was dangerous, and force worked. In the aftermath, the Senate reasserted control. Some reforms survived in diluted form. Grain distributions continued. Certain legal changes endured. But the broader vision, the rebalancing of power and citizenship, was abandoned. Stability was restored, but at the cost of trust. Rome was no longer a state confident in its ability to correct itself peacefully. The political language of the Republic shifted permanently. Appeals to tradition replaced appeals to justice. Accusations of tyranny silenced dissent. Emergency powers became acceptable tools. The Republic's fear of kings had mutated into fear of reformers. And yet, the problems the Gracchi had confronted did not disappear. Land continued to concentrate. Veterans continued to suffer. Allies remained excluded. The Republic postponed resolution while absorbing the lesson that violence could bypass debate. This lesson would not be forgotten. Ambitious men were watching. Soldiers were listening. The Forum had been stained with blood, and blood, once spilled, changes what a society believes is possible. The Republic had survived the Gracchi, but it had been transformed. The question that now hung over Rome was no longer theoretical. It was urgent and unresolved. If reform invited death and inequality bred instability, what path remained? For Rome had proven it could kill its reformers. It had yet to learn whether it could survive the consequences. After the deaths of the Gracchi brothers, the Roman Republic stood outwardly intact, but inwardly altered in ways that could not be reversed. The institutions remained. The Senate convened. Magistrates were elected. Laws were passed. Yet something essential had been broken. A boundary once assumed inviolable had been crossed, and Rome would never again govern with the same innocence. Violence had entered politics as an accepted instrument. The killings of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were not treated as crimes against the Republic. They were framed as acts of salvation. The Senate claimed it had defended the state against tyranny. In doing so, it reshaped the Republic's moral vocabulary. Opposition was no longer merely disagreement. It could be treason. Reform was no longer a civic act. It could be an existential threat. This logic was devastating. Future leaders absorbed the lesson quickly. The Gracchi had followed the law and died. Their reforms had sought to strengthen the Republic and were met with clubs and swords. The conclusion was unmistakable. Legality alone offered no protection. If one wished to change Rome, one would need more than votes and speeches. Force had proven effective. The Senate, for its part, emerged hardened and defensive. It had preserved its dominance, but at the cost of legitimacy. Its authority now rested not solely on tradition and consensus, but on its willingness to sanction violence. Each future crisis would draw more readily on emergency powers. The Senatus Consultum Ultimum became a precedent, an elastic justification for suspending law in the name of order. The Republic had learned how to silence dissent. Yet the conditions that produced the Gracchi did not disappear. Land remained concentrated in vast estates. Enslaved labor continued to displace citizens. Veterans still struggled to reintegrate. Rome's Italian allies remained excluded from citizenship despite their sacrifices. Inequality deepened even as political space narrowed. This contradiction sharpened the stakes of every future conflict. Political competition intensified. Candidates no longer trusted procedure to protect them. Alliances hardened. Rhetoric grew more extreme. Accusations of tyranny, corruption, and betrayal became weapons. Debate ceased to be a means of resolution and became a prelude to confrontation. The Republic had always been competitive, but now it was combustible. Most dangerously, the army loomed ever larger in the background of politics. Veterans watched how the state treated those who fought for it. Soldiers learned that loyalty to the Republic did not guarantee justice or reward. They also learned that decisive force could achieve what law couldn't. Generals, too, were watching. The Gracchi had mobilized popular support but lacked armed backing. They had trusted institutions that ultimately failed them. Future leaders would draw different conclusions. They would seek not only votes, but loyalty, personal, durable, and armed. The Republic had unwittingly prepared the ground for a new kind of politics, one where legitimacy flowed from success rather than law, where emergency powers became routine, where the line between defender and destroyer of the state blurred beyond recognition. In killing the Gracchi, Rome had postponed reform but accelerated decay. The tragedy lay not only in their deaths, but in the path their failure forced upon the Republic. Peaceful correction had been discredited. Gradual adjustment had been met with brutality. The Republic had signaled that it could no longer heal itself without violence. From this moment onward, Rome's political crises would escalate rather than resolve. Each generation would inherit deeper divisions, sharper grievances, and fewer peaceful tools. What had once been a flexible system now resisted change with force, until force became the only language left. The Republic did not collapse in the wake of the Gracchi. It endured. But endurance is not the same as health. Rome had survived reform by destroying its reformers. In doing so, it had revealed a terrifying truth about itself, that stability could be preserved through blood, and that bloodshed could be justified as duty. This realization would echo through every future crisis. For when a society proves it can kill in the name of order, it teaches its most ambitious citizens how to rule. And the Republic's next chapter would be written not by reformers seeking balance, but by soldiers who understood the lesson too well. From this moment forward, Rome would no longer ask whether violence belonged in politics, only who would wield it next. Chapter 8. Armies of Loyalty. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, the Roman Republic faced a paradox of its own making. It commanded the most formidable military force in the Mediterranean, disciplined, experienced, and victorious. Yet that very force was slipping beyond the Republic's control. The army that had once embodied civic duty was becoming something else entirely: professional, permanent, and personal. For centuries, Rome's military system had rested on a simple assumption. Soldiers were citizens. They owned land. They fought temporarily, returned home, and resumed civilian life. Their loyalty flowed naturally to the Republic because the Republic protected their livelihoods. War and citizenship were bound together by property and participation. That balance had been shattered. The long wars of expansion, especially the Punic conflicts, had drained the countryside of small landowners. Farms were lost. Veterans returned to poverty. Increasingly, Rome lacked the very class that had once filled its legions. The Republic still needed soldiers, but the citizen farmer was disappearing. Necessity forced change. The transformation began quietly, justified as practical reform rather than revolution. Recruitment standards were lowered, property requirements were relaxed, then abandoned altogether. For the first time, the landless poor the Capititensi, counted only by their heads, were welcomed into the army. This decision solved an immediate problem. Rome now had access to an almost limitless pool of manpower, but it introduced a far more dangerous one. These new soldiers did not fight for land they owned. They fought for wages, for food, for the promise of reward at the end of service. The Republic could offer little of this directly. Generals could. Commanders now provided pay, equipment, and, most importantly, hope. Veterans expected land grants, spoils, or pensions when campaigns ended. These rewards were not guaranteed by law. They depended on influence, negotiation, and success. The soldier's future rested not in the Senate, but in the man who led him. Loyalty shifted accordingly. The army became professional. Service lasted years, sometimes decades. Soldiers trained constantly. They marched farther, fought harder, and endured conditions unimaginable to earlier citizen militias. In return, they developed a powerful identity, not as temporary defenders of the Republic, but as members of a fighting brotherhood bound to a commander. This bond was forged in hardship. Campaigns were long, supplies were scarce, survival depended on leadership. A general who fed his men, shared their danger, and delivered victory earned devotion deeper than any civic oath. The Republic still believed these armies belonged to the state. In reality, they belonged to experience and to gratitude. As military command grew more important, so did the men who held it. Successful generals emerged as political figures of unprecedented weight. Their reputations extended beyond Rome, carried by veterans who voted, protested, and demanded reward. Military success translated directly into influence at home. The old safeguards remained on paper. Commands were temporary. Armies were not to enter Italy. Authority ended at the city's sacred boundary. But these rules assumed a kind of army that no longer existed. The Republic had built its defenses against kings. It had not prepared for generals whose power came not from title, but from loyalty freely given by armed men. This transformation did not occur through a single decree. It unfolded through necessity, war, and neglect. Each campaign reinforced the new reality. Each veteran settlement bound soldiers more closely to leaders who delivered what the state could not. At the same time, the Senate found itself increasingly dependent on these commanders. Crises abroad demanded experienced leadership. The same men were appointed repeatedly. Terms were extended. Exceptional authority became routine. The logic of empire rewarded continuity over rotation. Rome's political imagination struggled to keep pace. The Republic still feared monarchy in name, but it tolerated something just as dangerous in practice: individuals whose power rested on personal loyalty backed by force. Kingship had been rejected because it concentrated authority. Now, authority was concentrating again, distributed not through law, but through allegiance. The army, once Rome's greatest strength, was becoming its greatest vulnerability. For a republic can survive ambitious men. It cannot survive armies that follow them. This truth had not yet fully revealed itself. Rome still believed its traditions could restrain any individual. It still trusted that loyalty to the state would prevail over loyalty to a man. But the foundations were shifting. The legions were no longer merely instruments of policy. They were becoming instruments of power. As the Roman army transformed, so too did the nature of power within the Republic. Military command was no longer a temporary responsibility, it was a gateway. A successful general returned not merely with victory, but with something far more potent: veterans whose lives, futures, and identities were bound to him. These men did not disappear into private life. They remained a visible, organized presence within Roman society. The forum began to change. Veterans gathered in assemblies, voted as blocks, and demanded fulfillment of promises made on campaign. Land, pensions, legal protections, These were not abstract benefits. They were survival. And when the Senate hesitated or resisted, veterans did not blame the Republic. They blamed those who stood between them and the rewards their commander had promised. Thus, political pressure gained a new edge. Generals learned quickly that military success could be converted into legislative leverage. A commander who returned with loyal troops possessed influence unmatched by oratory alone. He could sway elections. He could intimidate rivals without unsheathing a sword. The mere presence of armed loyalty, even unspoken, reshaped political calculation. The Republic's old defenses weakened further. Traditionally, no army could legally enter Italy under arms. This rule had once ensured that political life remained separate from military force, but enforcement depended on custom, not capability. As commanders gained prestige and soldiers' loyalty deepened, the psychological barrier eroded. The idea that an army might intervene in politics, once unthinkable, became imaginable. This imagination was dangerous. The Senate, sensing the shift, attempted to reassert authority. It delayed veteran settlements. It resisted land grants. It reminded commanders of legal limits. But these efforts often backfired. Each denial hardened resentment. Each delay increased dependence on the general who promised to fight for his men. Rome had created a system where obligation flowed downward, but loyalty flowed upward. The army itself evolved culturally. Soldiers no longer identified primarily as citizens from specific tribes or regions. They identified as members of legions, bound by shared campaigns, rituals, and hardships. Standards, symbols, and oaths reinforced this collective identity. The legion became a family, one that transcended civic divisions. In this environment, discipline intensified. Punishments were severe. Rewards were personal. Obedience was not merely enforced, it was internalized. A soldier trusted his commander with his life. That trust, once earned, was not easily redirected toward an abstract state. The Republic still insisted that armies were instruments of the Senate and people. But instruments do not choose whom they serve. As crises multiplied across the empire, rebellions, invasions, instability, the Senate increasingly relied on proven commanders. The same men were appointed again and again. Extraordinary commands became normalized. Authority accumulated not through ambition alone, but through perceived necessity. This created a feedback loop. Success led to command. Command built loyalty. Loyalty increased political influence. Influence secured further command. Each cycle deepened the general's power while hollowing the Republic's control. Rome had always feared kings because kings ruled for life. Now it faced something more fluid and more dangerous. Men whose authority expanded organically, without titles, limits, or explicit intent. They did not call themselves rulers. They claimed to defend the Republic, yet their capacity to shape events exceeded that of any magistrate. The Republic's institutions struggled to respond. Laws could restrict office, but not allegiance. Elections could rotate titles, but not loyalty earned in battle. Tradition could condemn ambition, but not erase gratitude. The tools designed to prevent tyranny proved ineffective against power that grew outside their reach. Public life reflected this tension. Politics became polarized. Debates hardened into personal rivalries. Accusations of treason and tyranny flew freely. Each faction feared not only losing influence, but being destroyed by opponents backed by force. The Republic was no longer merely competitive. It was unstable. The army's role in this instability was central but indirect. Soldiers did not march on Rome, yet. They did not overthrow institutions, yet. But their existence altered every calculation. Political actors spoke with one eye on the legions, one ear on veterans' demands. Rome had crossed into a new phase of its history. The Republic still stood, its forms remained, its laws endured, But power now resided increasingly where armed loyalty concentrated. Authority flowed toward those who could command obedience beyond the law. This was not an accident. It was the logical outcome of professionalization without political adaptation. The Republic had changed its army without changing itself. And that imbalance would soon demand resolution. For a state cannot endure indefinitely when its greatest strength answers to personal allegiance rather than collective authority. The legions had been forged to defend Rome. They were now poised to decide its fate. By the early 1st century BCE, the transformation was complete. Rome still spoke of laws, elections, and civic virtue, but beneath these words lay a stark reality. Power now rested with men who commanded loyalty, backed by force. The Republic's most feared threat was no longer monarchy in name. It was military allegiance without institutional control. The army had become Rome's shadow government. Generals no longer needed crowns to rule. They needed soldiers who trusted them more than the state, and the Republic itself had taught those soldiers whom to trust. It had failed to guarantee land, pay, or security. It had allowed promises made on campaign to replace rights guaranteed by law. In doing so, it had shifted the axis of loyalty irreversibly. The consequences were visible everywhere. Veterans were mobilized politically. They marched in demonstrations. They occupied public spaces. They demanded legislation favoring their interests. Their commanders spoke for them, not as intermediaries, but as patrons. The relationship mirrored older systems of dependency, scaled now to armies rather than households. Rome's political language adapted uneasily. Leaders spoke of restoring order, defending tradition, protecting the Republic. Yet each faction increasingly relied on the threat of force, even when that force remained unspoken. Politics became a contest of strength, measured not only in votes, but in the loyalty one could command. The Senate found itself trapped. It needed strong generals to manage the empire's frontiers. Yet each appointment deepened the very problem it sought to contain. Efforts to rein in commanders through law proved ineffective. Authority could be granted. It could not easily be reclaimed. The Republic had created a class of men whose power exceeded their office. This reality eroded trust in institutions. Ordinary citizens learned that outcomes were shaped less by law than by leverage. Reformers and conservatives alike recognized that persuasion alone no longer sufficed. The Gracchi had shown that legality could be crushed. The legions now demonstrated that loyalty could override restraint. Rome's fear of kings had blinded it to a new form of domination. Kings ruled through titles and inheritance. Generals ruled through gratitude and fear. Their authority was less visible, but more adaptable. It could expand without declaration, contract without surrender, and justify itself as necessity. The Republic's safeguards. Annual terms, collegial offices, civilian oversight were designed for a different age. They assumed armies that disbanded, commanders who stepped aside, and citizens who returned to private life. None of these assumptions held. As Rome's political crises intensified, the temptation to resolve them through force grew stronger. Each faction feared being destroyed by the other. Each believed preemption justified. Each claimed to act in defense of the Republic. The stage was set. All that remained was a man willing to cross the final boundary to bring armed loyalty directly into the political arena. The taboo that armies must never enter Italy was weakening. The fear that had once restrained ambition had been dulled by precedent and necessity. The Republic had not yet fallen, but it had lost control of the very tool that had built its power. Rome's armies, once symbols of collective defense, were now instruments of personal ambition. They embodied discipline, courage, and sacrifice, but also dependency and coercion. They were loyal not to laws written in stone, but to promises made in blood. The tragedy lay not in the soldiers themselves. They had served faithfully. They had endured hardship. They had fought for Rome across continents. Their loyalty was earned, not stolen. The failure was institutional. The Republic had asked its armies to defend an empire without giving them a state capable of absorbing their service justly. In the absence of institutional care, loyalty found human anchors. And once loyalty attaches to individuals, it becomes a force no law can easily restrain. Rome stood on the edge of transformation. The next crisis would not be about reform or resistance. It would be about command, about whether the Republic could survive the return of armed men into its political heart. For the legions had learned to follow leaders, and soon a leader would learn how to follow the legions back to Rome. The Republic's greatest enemy had not marched from abroad. It had risen from within, forged in discipline, loyalty, and the unintended consequences of empire. Chapter 9. The Age of Strong Men. By the opening decades of the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic had entered an age it was never designed to endure. Its institutions still stood. Consuls were elected, the Senate convened, laws were debated. But authority no longer flowed naturally through these channels. Instead, power gathered around individuals whose influence exceeded office, tradition, and restraint. Rome had become a republic governed by exceptions. The roots of this transformation lay in crisis. Foreign wars, social unrest, and unresolved inequalities collided in rapid succession. Each emergency demanded decisive leadership. Each decisive leader required extraordinary authority. What had once been rare, special commands, extended terms, concentrated power, became routine. The Republic responded to every threat by bending its rules, convincing itself that necessity justified erosion. At the center of this age stood Gaius Marius. Marius was not born into Rome's highest aristocracy. He rose through military success, embodying the new reality of republican power. His victories against foreign enemies saved Rome from invasion. His reforms reshaped the army. His popularity with soldiers and voters alike propelled him into office again and again. Shot, Marius was elected consul an unprecedented 7 times. Each election was justified as necessity. Each extension of authority weakened the principle of rotation. Rome told itself that the rules could wait, that survival came first. And each time the exception became easier to repeat. Yet Marius was not merely a product of crisis, he was a warning. His rivalry with Lucius Cornelius Sulla exposed how far the Republic had drifted. Political competition hardened into personal hatred. Commands were contested not through debate, but through force. When the Senate reassigned a military command from Sulla to Marius, the unthinkable occurred. Sulla marched on Rome. No foreign army had breached the city's sacred boundaries for centuries. Roman law forbade generals from bringing troops into Italy. This taboo was foundational, a final safeguard separating military power from civic life. When Sulla violated it, he did more than seize control. He shattered a psychological barrier that had restrained ambition since the fall of kings. Rome watched its own legions occupy its streets. Sulla claimed necessity. He claimed to defend the Republic against corruption and chaos. His language echoed Rome's deepest fears and traditions, yet his actions revealed a new truth. Force could override law. The precedent was irreversible. Civil war followed. The Republic fractured into factions defined not by ideology, but by loyalty to leaders. Rome's political life ceased to function independently of military power. Elections, debates, and trials became secondary to the outcomes of campaigns. When Sulla emerged victorious, he did something unprecedented, yet carefully framed. He did not crown himself king. He accepted the title of dictator, revived from ancient emergency tradition. But unlike earlier dictators, Sulla ruled without a time limit. He claimed this, too, was temporary. Sulla's dictatorship was brutal and systematic. Through prescriptions, he identified enemies of the state, real and imagined, and sanctioned their execution without trial. Property was seized, families were destroyed, terror replaced trust. All was justified as restoration. Sulla insisted he was repairing the Republic. In form, he did. He strengthened the Senate. He curtailed the power of tribunes. He attempted to restore aristocratic dominance, and then, having rewritten the political order, he resigned voluntarily and retired. To some, this was proof of restraint. To history, it was proof of normalization. Rome had now witnessed armed marches, civil war, mass executions, and dictatorship, all enacted in the Republic's name. The ancient fear of kingship had not prevented tyranny. It had merely reshaped it. And Rome absorbed the lesson. Institutions survived, but their meaning changed. Law became an instrument wielded by the powerful rather than a boundary that constrained them. Emergency authority became an accepted solution to deadlock. Stability depended not on systems, but on men who claimed to embody order. In this environment, ambition adapted. Younger leaders studied the age closely. They saw what worked. They saw what failed. They learned that legitimacy followed success, not procedure. That the Republic could be bent or broken if one commanded loyalty, force, and narrative. The age of strong men had begun not with collapse, but with precedent. Rome still stood, but it now knew what was possible. Sulla's resignation should have restored faith in the Republic. Instead, it taught a far more dangerous lesson. Rome had seen that absolute power could be seized, exercised brutally, and then relinquished, without consequence. The message was unmistakable. The Republic would tolerate authoritarian rule if it was framed as restoration. This realization did not fade with Sulla's death. It spread. The generation that followed did not remember the Republic before civil war. They grew up in its aftermath, shaped by violence, precedent, and ambition. They understood that the old taboos had been broken and could not be repaired by nostalgia alone. What had once been unthinkable was now merely difficult. Among those who rose in this new environment was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. Pompey's ascent followed the logic of the age. He held no traditional magistracy when he was first entrusted with major command. His authority came from military success, not office. He defeated enemies abroad, pacified provinces, and returned to Rome celebrated as a savior. The Senate rewarded him with triumphs and extraordinary powers, each exception reinforcing the pattern. Pompey's commands were vast and unprecedented. He was granted authority over entire regions, with armies at his disposal and discretion over administration. These powers were justified as efficient solutions to extraordinary problems: piracy, rebellion, instability. Each time, the Republic reassured itself that the arrangement was temporary. Each time, it became easier to repeat. Pompey did not march on Rome. He did not declare dictatorship. He respected the forms of the Republic, and yet his influence eclipsed that of elected magistrates. His prestige shaped policy. His veterans shaped elections. His absence from Rome mattered as much as his presence. Power had found a new equilibrium, one that required no violence, only dependence. The Senate, increasingly divided and reactive, alternated between fear and flattery. It relied on strong men to manage crises it could not resolve itself. In doing so, it surrendered initiative. Authority flowed toward those who could act decisively rather than those who could deliberate wisely. Rome had become accustomed to being governed by men larger than its institutions. This habit reshaped political behavior. Leaders no longer sought gradual advancement through consensus alone. They sought commands that would elevate them beyond ordinary competition. Military success became the fastest path to supremacy. Civil authority bent around martial reputation. At the same time, the memory of Sulla's violence lingered. No one forgot what armed power could do when unleashed. This created a fragile balance. Strong men were tolerated so long as they claimed restraint. Force hovered at the edges of politics, rarely used but always implied. The Republic existed in a state of permanent tension. Each crisis raised the same question: who should be entrusted with exceptional authority? Each answer weakened the system further. The Republic was no longer governed by predictable rules, but by negotiation with individuals whose power exceeded legal definition. Institutions survived, but they adapted defensively rather than creatively. Laws were passed to limit ambition, then circumvented in practice. Traditions were invoked selectively. The Republic relied increasingly on the character of its leaders rather than the strength of its systems. This reliance was fatal, for character is not a safeguard. The age of strong men normalized the idea that the Republic could be saved by extraordinary individuals. Each claimed to defend tradition while reshaping it to their advantage. Each insisted his power was temporary, necessary, and justified. Rome told itself that it remained free because no one had claimed the title of king. But freedom does not vanish with titles. It erodes through habit. The Republic had learned to accept domination so long as it arrived gradually and spoke the language of necessity. It had learned to confuse stability with health, order with justice. By the time Pompey reached the height of his power, Rome no longer asked whether strong men endangered the Republic. It asked only which strong men could manage it best. That question would soon demand an answer far more decisive than debate could provide. For the age of strong men had not yet reached its culmination. It had merely prepared the ground for the one figure who would understand its lessons fully and push them to their final conclusion. By the time the Republic reached the height of the age of strongmen, its transformation was no longer subtle. Rome still possessed institutions, but those institutions no longer possessed power in the way they once had. They functioned as stages upon which dominant individuals performed authority, rather than mechanisms that constrained it. The Republic endured in form, but its spirit had been hollowed out. What defined this age was not the collapse of law, but its instrumentalization. Laws were still passed, debated, and cited, but increasingly as tools rather than limits. Strong men learned to cloak ambition in legality, to bend procedure without openly breaking it. Emergency powers were framed as temporary. Exceptional commands were justified as unavoidable. Each maneuver preserved appearances while altering reality. The Senate, once the Republic's guiding conscience, became reactive and divided. It oscillated between resistance and accommodation, lacking the unity or credibility to enforce restraint. Fear shaped its decisions: fear of unrest, fear of armies, fear of being swept aside by the very men it empowered. In trying to preserve relevance, it surrendered authority. Rome was no longer governed by principle. It was governed by precedent. Each strong man cited the actions of his predecessors to justify his own. Marius had broken norms in the name of necessity. Sulla had seized power to restore order. Pompey had accepted extraordinary command to protect stability. None claimed kingship. All claimed the Republic, and each left the system weaker than before. The people, too, adapted. Citizens no longer expected institutions to deliver justice or reform. They looked instead to individuals, men who could act, command, and provide. Loyalty followed success. Gratitude followed victory. Political identity became personal rather than civic. This shift reshaped Roman political culture. Elections became contests of influence, backed by reputation and force. Debate hardened into faction. Compromise was seen as weakness. The Republic's traditional suspicion of concentrated power eroded, replaced by weary acceptance. Rome had learned to live with domination so long as it arrived piecemeal. The most dangerous consequence of this age was normalization. Armed marches, once shocking, were now precedents. Dictatorship, once unthinkable, had been tried and survived. Civil war, once a nightmare, had become a memory rather than a taboo. Each boundary crossed became a reference point rather than a warning. The Republic still believed it could recover. It told itself that stability would return once the right men stepped aside, that institutions would reassert themselves when crises passed. That tradition, somehow, would heal what ambition had damaged. But tradition cannot restrain power that no longer fears it. Strong men did not destroy the Republic outright. They relied on it. They needed its legitimacy, its symbols, its language. In doing so, they ensured its survival, but only as a shell. The Republic became a means to power rather than its source. Stability now depended on individuals who claimed restraint rather than systems that enforced it. This dependency was unsustainable. For individuals age, die, and compete. Systems endure only if they command obedience beyond personality. Rome had reversed this equation. It had placed its future in the hands of men whose ambitions could not be harmonized indefinitely. The age of strong men was not an aberration. It was a transition. The Republic had proven it could survive kings, class conflict, reform, and even civil war. What it had not proven was whether it could survive success without restraint. The power accumulated through conquest had found expression through individuals rather than institutions, and it would not disperse quietly. Rome stood at a point of no return. The question was no longer whether strong men endangered the Republic. That truth was undeniable. The question was which strong man would emerge dominant, and what he would do with the power history had placed in his hands. For the Republic had trained its own successors. It had taught ambitious men how to seize authority without crowns, how to justify force as necessity, how to claim tradition while reshaping it beyond recognition. The final act would not come as a sudden coup, but as the culmination of habits long established. The age of strong men had normalized rule by exceptional individuals. What followed would determine whether Rome could ever return to being governed by law, or whether law itself would be subordinated permanently to power. And as rival ambitions now converged upon the Republic's fragile center, the next conflict would not be resolved by compromise, but by a single, irreversible choice. Chapter 10. Caesar's Crossing. In the long history of the Roman Republic, there were moments of crisis, moments of violence, moments when tradition bent beneath ambition. But there was only one moment when it finally broke. It did not occur in the Forum or the Senate chamber. It took place on a cold frontier river in northern Italy, quiet, unremarkable, and yet destined to change the course of history. Chut, the Rubicon. By the late 50s BCE, Julius Caesar stood at the center of Rome's contradictions. He was everything the age of strongmen had produced: a brilliant general, a shrewd politician, and a master of loyalty. His campaigns in Gaul had brought Rome unprecedented wealth, territory, and glory. His legions were hardened by years of war and devoted to him personally. His name carried weight not only in Rome, but across the Republic's expanding world. Yet success bred fear. Caesar's rivals, most notably Pompey and the senatorial elite, did not question his achievements. They questioned his intentions. Rome's history had taught them what unchecked command could become. They saw in Caesar the culmination of decades of erosion, a man whose power exceeded law, whose popularity threatened restraint, whose army answered to him alone. The Senate demanded that Caesar lay down his command, and return to Rome as a private citizen. To them, this was a defense of the Republic. To Caesar, it was a death sentence. Without his imperium, he would face prosecution by enemies determined to destroy him politically and perhaps physically. The Republic offered him a choice that was no choice at all: submission or annihilation. Caesar understood the stakes. For centuries, Rome's final safeguard against tyranny had been clear and absolute. No general could bring an army into Italy. This prohibition was not merely legal, it was sacred. It separated military power from civic life. It was the last barrier standing between republic and monarchy. On the night Caesar crossed the Rubicon, that barrier fell. With a small force at first, Caesar led his troops into Italy, committing an act of open defiance against the Senate's authority. According to later tradition, he acknowledged the gravity of his decision with a single phrase, alea iacta est. The die is cast, whether spoken or not. The meaning was unmistakable. There would be no return. Civil war erupted with astonishing speed. Pompey and the Senate fled Rome, unprepared for the swiftness of Caesar's advance. Cities opened their gates. Officials defected. The Republic's institutions dissolved under pressure, revealing how thoroughly loyalty had shifted from system to individuals. Caesar did not march as a conqueror, but as a claimant, insisting he acted in defense of Roman liberty even as he dismantled its foundations. The war that followed was brutal but decisive. Battles raged across Italy, Greece, Africa, and Spain. Rome's fate was decided not by law or vote, but by arms. When Caesar emerged victorious, there was no rival left capable of challenging him. He did not declare himself king. He did not abolish the republic. Instead, he became dictator, first temporarily, then for life. Caesar understood Rome's psychology too well to ignore it. Kingship remained hated. Tradition still mattered. So he preserved the forms of the republic while concentrating power within himself. Magistracies continued. The Senate met. Laws were passed. But all authority flowed from one man. His rule brought real reform. Debt was reduced. Veterans were settled. Provinces were reorganized. Corruption was curbed. Caesar ruled with clemency toward former enemies, seeking reconciliation rather than terror. To many Romans exhausted by decades of instability, he appeared as a savior, a figure capable of restoring order where institutions had failed. To others, he was something far more dangerous. Caesar embodied everything the Republic had feared since the fall of kings: permanent authority, personal loyalty, and unchecked command. His mercy unsettled as much as it reassured. His popularity overshadowed tradition. His power was legal but overwhelming. The Republic still existed, but it no longer ruled. A group of senators convinced themselves that only one act could restore liberty. They believed that removing Caesar would revive the old order, that the Republic, freed from domination, would reclaim its authority. They were wrong. When Julius Caesar fell beneath their knives, they did not save the Republic. They exposed it. For the question was no longer whether Caesar ruled Rome, but whether Rome could rule itself. When Julius Caesar emerged victorious from civil war, Rome entered a moment of uneasy calm. The streets were quiet. The legions were loyal. The Senate returned to its chamber. On the surface, order had been restored. But beneath that calm lay a profound uncertainty, one that touched every corner of Roman political life. Caesar ruled a republic that no longer trusted itself. Unlike Sulla, Caesar did not govern through terror. There were no mass proscriptions, no public lists of enemies condemned to die. Instead, he chose mercy, pardoning former rivals, restoring their property, even elevating some to office. This clemency was deliberate. Caesar believed reconciliation was the only way to stabilize a fractured state. Violence had nearly destroyed Rome. He would not repeat it. Yet mercy carried its own dangers. By sparing his enemies, Caesar unsettled the traditional logic of Roman politics. Defeat had once meant ruin. Now it meant dependence. Senators who owed their lives to Caesar found themselves bound to him, not by fear, but by obligation. gratitude replaced autonomy. The Republic's elite survived, but under a shadow they could not escape. Power flowed increasingly toward the dictator. Caesar accumulated offices and honors at a pace that alarmed even his supporters. He was named consul repeatedly, granted tribunician powers, and awarded lifelong dictatorship. Statues were erected in his image. His likeness appeared on coins, a symbolic break with Republican tradition. Though he rejected the title of king, the distinction grew increasingly thin. Caesar insisted that these honors were necessary. Rome, he argued, required continuity. Its institutions had proven incapable of governing an empire or resolving internal conflict. Strong, centralized authority was not tyranny, it was medicine. Many Romans agreed. Decades of civil war had eroded faith in the old order. The Senate was divided, compromised, and slow. Assemblies were volatile and easily manipulated. Law had failed to restrain ambition. Caesar offered something tangible: stability. Roads were built, debts reduced, colonies founded, provinces reorganized. The machinery of governance began to function again. But this functionality came at a price. The Republic's spirit, its emphasis on shared authority, rotation of office, and collective restraint, was fading. Decisions were made efficiently, but not collaboratively. Debate continued, but it no longer shaped outcomes. The Senate advised, but Caesar decided. The contradiction became unbearable for many of Rome's traditionalists. They saw in Caesar not a savior, but a living reminder of everything the Republic had once rejected. His rule was legal, popular, and effective, and that made it more dangerous than overt tyranny. If Rome accepted this model, the Republic would not merely fall, it would be replaced. Whispers of kingship spread, fueled by rumors and symbolism. A crown placed at Caesar's feet during public games was theatrically rejected, but the gesture lingered. Whether Caesar desired kingship mattered less than what his power represented: permanence. For men raised on the Republic's founding trauma, permanence was intolerable. A group of senators, many of them former allies or beneficiaries of Caesar's mercy, convinced themselves that assassination was not murder, but duty. They styled themselves liberators, heirs to the men who had expelled Rome's kings centuries earlier. In their minds, Caesar was not a dictator. They were patriots. On the Ides of March, they acted. The assassination was swift, chaotic, and public. Caesar was stabbed in the Senate House, the very institution he had preserved in form while emptying of authority. Blood pooled where debate once ruled. The liberators proclaimed the Republic restored. But the city did not respond as they expected. There was no spontaneous celebration, no return to old certainties. The Senate did not reclaim authority. The people did not rally to tradition. Instead, Rome fell silent, stunned, uncertain, and afraid. The problem was not Caesar's death. It was what his death revealed. The Republic had not been waiting to reassert itself. It had been leaning on Caesar. He had become the axis around which stability turned. When he was removed, nothing rushed to fill the void, except confusion. The assassins had killed a man. They had not resurrected a system. For years, Rome had relied on individuals to resolve crises its institutions could not manage. Caesar had been the most successful of them. Removing him did not undo decades of erosion. It exposed it. The old order could not simply be restarted. It no longer commanded loyalty. It no longer inspired confidence. It no longer functioned independently of force. The Republic stood leaderless, directionless, and vulnerable. Its final safeguard against tyranny shattered, its institutions hollowed by reliance on exceptional men. The assassination was meant to end the crisis. Instead, it proved that the crisis had already consumed the Republic from within. In the days after Caesar's assassination, Rome did not erupt in triumph. It unraveled in silence. The conspirators had imagined themselves as liberators stepping into history's light. They expected gratitude, relief, perhaps even reverence. Instead, they were met with uncertainty and fear. The republic they believed they had restored did not rise to meet them. It hesitated, paralyzed by the very weaknesses Caesar's rule had concealed. The Senate convened, but it did not command. The assemblies gathered, but they did not decide. Authority drifted, unanchored. Caesar's death revealed an uncomfortable truth. The republic no longer existed as a functioning system. It survived as memory, language, and ritual, but not as an independent source of power. For years, Rome had depended on extraordinary men to resolve extraordinary problems. Caesar had simply been the most successful expression of that dependency. Now he was gone. His funeral exposed the depth of the republic's transformation. When Caesar's body was displayed before the people, grief turned to fury. Veterans remembered their general. Citizens remembered stability. The crowd did not mourn a tyrant. They mourned a protector. The conspirators, once confident in their cause, fled the city. The people had not chosen the republic. They had chosen order. This was the final indictment of Rome's institutions. They no longer commanded emotional loyalty. They could not mobilize support. They could not guarantee security. The old order, stripped of its strongest defender, stood naked before a population that no longer believed in its capacity to govern. Power rushed to fill the vacuum. Caesar's lieutenants moved swiftly. Mark Antony, skilled in rhetoric and ruthless in ambition, positioned himself as the guardian of Caesar's legacy. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, arrived quietly but decisively, armed not with experience, but with legitimacy and calculation. Legions waited, watching to see where loyalty would settle. The republic became a prize. Its laws were cited, its offices invoked, its traditions weaponized. But no one truly believed that consensus or restraint would decide Rome's future. That era had passed with Caesar across the Rubicon. Civil war returned, not as anomaly, but as inheritance. The assassination had been intended to end the cycle of domination. Instead, it accelerated it. Caesar's death proved that power rooted in personal loyalty could not be removed surgically. Cut away the figure, and the forces that sustained him remained: armies, ambitions, expectations. The Republic's final safeguard had failed twice. First, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Second, when his death failed to restore what had been lost. Rome's founders had believed that no one man should rule. They had built a system of shared authority, rotation, and mistrust to enforce that belief. But they had also assumed a society small enough, cohesive enough, and restrained enough to sustain it. Empire had destroyed those assumptions. By the time Caesar fell, the Republic was already hollow. Its institutions could not compete with the efficiency, clarity, and decisiveness of individual rule. Nor could they command loyalty in a world shaped by war, inequality, and fear. Caesar had not created this reality. He had merely mastered it. His assassination did not revive the Republic. It confirmed its irrelevance. From this moment forward, Rome would no longer ask whether one man should rule. The question would become which man and under what name. Kingship, long despised, would return disguised as restoration, stability, and peace. The Republic's tragedy was not that it fell suddenly. It was that it died slowly, compromised by necessity, eroded by precedent, and finally exposed by the removal of the one figure holding its contradiction together. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon was irreversible, not because it broke a law, but because it revealed a truth. The Republic no longer possessed the authority to enforce its own limits. That authority now belonged to force, loyalty, and fear. And as Rome descended once more into civil war, it became clear that the Republic's fate would not be decided by votes or debates, but by the outcome of a struggle between men shaped entirely by the world Caesar had left behind. With the Rubicon long behind it and the Republic stripped bare, Rome stood on the threshold of a new order, one that would promise peace at the cost of everything the Republic had once been. Nay. Chapter 11. The Republic's Last Breath. After the knives fell in the Senate House, Rome did not return to the Republic of memory. It drifted into something far more dangerous, a state without a center. Caesar was gone, but the forces that had elevated him remained fully alive. Armies still stood under arms, ambition still burned, institutions still existed, yet none commanded unquestioned authority. The Republic breathed, but only faintly. In the immediate aftermath, Rome tried to speak the language of continuity. Senators declared amnesties, magistracies were filled, decrees were issued in the familiar style of an older age. The forms of governance persisted, carefully preserved like sacred relics, but behind these rituals lay paralysis. No one truly believed the system could govern without force. Power fractured instantly. Former allies turned rivals. Caesar's assassins discovered that killing a dictator did not grant legitimacy. They had no armies, no mass loyalty, no means to enforce their vision. Their appeal to tradition fell flat in a city that had learned to survive through strong leadership rather than shared restraint. The streets told the real story. Veterans gathered, restless and unpaid. Citizens listened not to senatorial debates, but to speeches that promised protection, stability, and reward. Fear replaced nostalgia. The Republic's authority had once rested on belief in law, precedent, and mutual restraint. That belief was gone. Into this vacuum stepped men who understood the new rules. Mark Antony moved first, seizing control of Caesar's papers, treasury, and political legacy. He spoke as Caesar's heir in all but name, positioning himself as guardian of the people and the army. His power did not come from office. It came from proximity to Caesar and influence over legions. Then came Octavian. Young, untested, and underestimated, he arrived in Rome not with armies, but with legitimacy. Caesar had adopted him. That single fact transformed a teenager into a political force. Veterans listened, senators hesitated. Power recalibrated around inheritance rather than election. The Republic watched as authority consolidated, not through law, but through alignment. Temporary alliances formed, bound not by principle, but by fear of rivals. The so-called Second Triumvirate emerged as a blunt admission of reality. Rome could no longer be governed through collective deliberation. It required division of spoils among the powerful. This arrangement did not restore order. It institutionalized violence. Proscriptions returned, lists of enemies marked for death, property was seized, old grudges were settled under legal cover. Terror once again became policy, justified as necessity. The Republic's last safeguards were repurposed as instruments of elimination. Elections continued, but they no longer mattered. Outcomes were decided before ballots were cast. Assemblies approved what force had already settled. Law followed power, not the other way around. Rome had crossed into a terminal phase. The Republic existed as memory and vocabulary, invoked to legitimize acts that would once have been unthinkable. Men spoke of liberty while wielding swords. They claimed to defend tradition while dismantling its last protections. The contradiction was no longer hidden. It was accepted. For ordinary Romans, survival replaced civic participation. Loyalty shifted to whoever could guarantee food, security, and peace. Ideals faded beneath exhaustion. The Republic's promise, shared governance, restraint, balance, felt distant and impractical in a world defined by chaos. Romans still honored their past. They invoked ancestors. They celebrated old victories. They told themselves that this turmoil was temporary, that once the right men prevailed, the Republic would return. But beneath this hope lay quiet resignation. The Republic no longer governed. It endured only because Romans could not yet imagine its absence. But imagination would soon give way to reality. For the conflicts unleashed after Caesar's death would not resolve into restoration. They would resolve into concentration, power narrowing, hardening, and settling where resistance could no longer reach. The Republic's final breath was not dramatic. It was labored, uncertain, and prolonged. And as Rome stumbled forward, guided not by institutions but by force, the question was no longer whether the Republic could be saved, but who would inherit what remained of it. As violence tightened its grip on Rome, the Republic became a ghost that haunted its own ruins. It was still spoken of with reverence, still cited in speeches and decrees, but it no longer acted. The language of liberty endured long after liberty itself had lost meaning. Rome was living inside the shell of a system that no longer governed. The Second Triumvirate formalized this decay. Unlike earlier alliances disguised as cooperation, this was naked consolidation. Power was divided openly between men who commanded armies and controlled resources. Law followed their agreements. Magistracies existed to ratify decisions already made. The Senate, once the Republic's stabilizing force, was reduced to an audience, consulted when convenient, ignored when not. Violence was no longer exceptional. It became administrative. Proscriptions swept through the city and beyond. Names appeared on lists, not because of crimes, but because of utility. Wealth determined fate. Old friendships offered no protection. Fear permeated daily life, teaching Romans to remain silent, compliant, invisible. The Republic's most sacred promise that citizens were protected by law had evaporated. Yet even in this darkness, Romans clung to ritual. Elections were held, offices were filled, temples stood open, festivals continued. The city performed normalcy while bleeding beneath the surface. Tradition became theater, comforting, familiar, and utterly detached from power. This performance mattered. It allowed Romans to believe continuity still existed, that chaos was temporary, that the Republic could be restored once the violence ended. But violence had become structural. It was no longer a response to crisis. It was the method of governance itself. Meanwhile, the armies waited. Legions that had once sworn loyalty to Caesar now divided their allegiance among new patrons. Antony commanded experience and proximity to power. Octavian offered legitimacy and calculation. Lepidus held influence but little ambition. Each strong man maneuvered carefully, aware that open confrontation could destroy them all. The Republic was no longer the prize. Control of the army was. As battles erupted across Italy and the provinces, Rome ceased to be the center of decision-making. Power shifted to camps, fleets, and distant battlefields. The city that had once ruled the world now waited anxiously for news carried by messengers. Its fate was decided elsewhere. This inversion marked the Republic's final decline. The state that had once controlled armies now followed them. Laws were written to justify outcomes achieved through force. Victors spoke of peace while preparing for the next war. The Republic's institutions had become reactive, not directive. For many Romans, this reality was unbearable, but also undeniable. Older men recalled a time when debate mattered, when votes shaped outcomes, when ambition was restrained by custom. Younger Romans knew only instability. To them, the Republic was not a living system. It was a story. And stories cannot govern. The triumvirate eventually fractured, as all such arrangements do. Power, once shared, demands resolution. Rivalries sharpened. Alliances dissolved. The cycle of civil war resumed, not as tragedy, but as inevitability. Through it all, the Republic persisted in name. Its laws were cited, its offices filled, its symbols honored. But authority no longer resided within it. It had been hollowed out by necessity, then by precedent, and finally by acceptance. Rome had reached a point where restoration was no longer possible through return. There was no path back to what had been lost. The Republic's structures could not be revived because the conditions that sustained them no longer existed. Empire required concentration. Peace demanded decisiveness. Stability followed strength. Romans sensed this, even if they could not yet articulate it. They clung to the Republic because it was familiar, not because it worked. And as the wars ground on, exhausting resources and patience alike, a quieter longing began to replace the old ideals, not for liberty, not for debate, but for peace. Whatever the cost. That longing would soon find an answer. For while the Republic gasped its last breaths, a new order was forming, one that promised an end to chaos, an end to uncertainty, and an end to the endless struggle between men who claimed to save a system already beyond rescue. The Republic was dying. But Rome was preparing to live on. The Roman Republic did not fall in a single moment of defeat. There was no final vote, no dramatic proclamation, no symbolic destruction of its institutions. Instead, it faded, slowly, unevenly, and almost quietly, until what remained was memory rather than authority. Rome reached the end of its republican life, not through collapse, but through exhaustion. By the final years of civil war, few still believed in restoration. The Senate continued to meet, but it no longer initiated policy. Assemblies gathered, but they confirmed decisions already enforced by arms. Magistrates held office, but their power existed only where it did not conflict with that of generals. The Republic persisted in form, emptied of substance. This condition was not imposed from above. It was accepted. Romans had lived through decades of instability, violence, and fear. They had watched reformers die, generals march on Rome, and laws bend beneath necessity. They had seen power concentrate, fracture, and reconsolidate. Through it all, one lesson had been reinforced relentlessly. Institutions could not protect them. Security came from strength. As the final conflict narrowed to a struggle between remaining rivals, Rome's population did not rally to defend the Republic. They waited. They endured. They hoped for an end. Loyalty followed those who could deliver peace, not those who invoked tradition. This quiet shift sealed the Republic's fate. When the last resistance collapsed and power consolidated, there was no mass protest, no uprising in defense of Republican ideals. The city did not resist transformation because transformation promised relief. Romans had grown weary of instability. Order, even imposed, was preferable to chaos justified by liberty. The Republic died because it no longer commanded belief. Its founding trauma, the rejection of kingship, had once defined Roman identity, but centuries of empire had transformed that fear. Kingship was no longer the enemy. Disorder was. Concentrated authority, once despised, now seemed necessary. This reversal did not require renaming the state. The Republic's symbols endured, its language persisted, its rituals continued. Rome did not abolish the Republic. It absorbed it into something new. Titles changed slowly. Authority shifted gradually. Continuity masked transformation. This was Rome's genius and its tragedy. By preserving form, Rome avoided open rupture. By denying change, it eased acceptance. The Republic did not fall. It was repurposed. What emerged was not monarchy as Rome had once known it. There was no crown, no throne, no declaration of kingship. Instead, power gathered around a single figure who claimed to restore, not replace. The Republic became a legitimizing memory rather than a governing reality. This transition succeeded because it aligned with Roman psychology. Romans had always valued stability, order, and tradition. The new order promised all three. It claimed to end civil war, preserve Roman greatness, and honor ancestral customs. It offered peace without demanding the abandonment of identity. The Republic's last breath was taken not in panic, but in resignation. There was no single day when Romans realized it was gone. There was only a growing awareness that something essential had slipped away and that life continued regardless. The tragedy of the Republic lies not in its destruction, but in its endurance beyond usefulness. It survived long enough to be hollowed out, manipulated, and finally set aside without resistance. In this way, the Republic's end was its greatest failure. It had been designed to restrain power. It had been consumed by it. It had taught generations to fear kings, yet prepared them to accept something far more enduring. As Rome stood poised to enter a new era, one truth had become unavoidable. The Republic could no longer govern an empire. Its institutions had not adapted quickly enough to contain the forces they had unleashed. And so, without ceremony or collapse, the Republic gave way. Not to tyranny as Rome once feared it, but to authority as Rome had learned to need it. The Republic's final breath passed quietly, leaving behind a world ready to be ruled and a city prepared to trade liberty for peace. Chapter 12. From Republic to Empire. When the final wars ended and the dust of decades of bloodshed settled, Rome stood exhausted, but alive. The city that had survived kings, conquest, reform, and civil war now faced a different challenge: how to live after chaos. The Roman world did not ask for liberty anymore, it asked for peace. Into this moment stepped Augustus. He did not arrive as a conqueror in chains of victory, nor as a tyrant claiming divine right. He arrived quietly, deliberately, and with profound understanding of Roman memory. He had watched the Republic tear itself apart. He had seen what naked power provoked and what it destroyed. Augustus would rule Rome not by abolishing its past, but by preserving its appearance. The genius of the transition lay in denial. Formally, nothing ended. The Senate still met, magistracies still existed, laws were still passed in familiar language, elections continued. The Republic lived, on parchment, in ritual, in memory. But beneath these forms, power had shifted decisively and irreversibly. Augustus held no crown. Instead, he accumulated titles rooted in Republican tradition: princeps, first citizen; imperator, victorious commander; tribune for life, guardian of the state. Each title carried precedent. Each avoided the language of kingship. Together, they placed all meaningful authority into one set of hands. Rome accepted this arrangement because it felt familiar. After generations of instability, Augustus offered something no one else could: an end to civil war. Armies were disbanded or professionalized under central command. Veterans were settled. Provinces were reorganized. Borders stabilized. Law functioned again. The machinery of governance, long distorted by rivalry, began to move smoothly. Peace returned. But peace required submission. The Senate no longer directed policy, it endorsed it. Assemblies no longer decided outcomes, they confirmed them. Debate survived, but it no longer shaped the future. Authority flowed downward from the center, not outward from collective decision. The Republic had been preserved in name while rendered politically inert. This transformation succeeded because it aligned with Roman psychology. Romans despised kings, but they respected hierarchy. They feared tyranny, but they feared chaos more. Augustus did not ask Rome to abandon its identity. He promised to protect it. He restored temples, revived ancient customs, and spoke endlessly of tradition. He framed his rule as service, not domination. The illusion was convincing. To many Romans, the Republic had not died. It had been saved. Yet this salvation came with permanent consequences. Power was no longer contested openly. Political ambition narrowed into loyalty or exclusion. Dissent became dangerous not because it was illegal, but because it was ineffective. Stability replaced participation as the highest civic value. The Republic's 5-century experiment had reached its natural conclusion. It had not collapsed under external force. It had not been overthrown in a single act. It had transformed gradually, compromising here, adapting there, until its original purpose dissolved. The mechanisms designed to prevent kings had instead prepared the ground for one ruler who could operate without the title. Augustus did not destroy the Republic. He completed its evolution, and in doing so, he ensured Rome's survival for centuries, but as something fundamentally different from what its founders had imagined. The Republic's legacy, however, did not vanish. Its laws endured. Its concepts of citizenship, legal equality, and governance outlived its institutions. Long after emperors replaced consuls, Roman ideas would continue to shape how power was organized, justified, and restrained across civilizations yet unborn. Rome gained peace. It lost self-rule. And in that exchange lay the final, irreversible transformation of the ancient world. Augustus understood something his predecessors had not. Rome could accept domination only if it did not feel dominated. The Republic had died because it could no longer govern, but its memory still governed Roman emotion. To rule Rome, one had to respect that memory, even while rendering it powerless. So Augustus ruled indirectly. He refused grand titles. He declined the crown. He insisted publicly that he was restoring the Republic, not replacing it. The Senate, grateful for survival and stripped of alternatives, accepted this narrative eagerly. It granted Augustus authority piece by piece, each power framed as temporary, necessary, and rooted in precedent. In reality, these powers never expired. As princeps, Augustus positioned himself as the first among equals, not a monarch. Yet this status granted him unmatched influence over senatorial debate and decision. As holder of tribunician power for life, he could propose legislation, veto opposition, and claim to act in defense of the people. As supreme military commander, he controlled the legions, now stationed permanently along the empire's frontiers, far from Rome. This separation was deliberate. By removing armies from Italy and placing them under centralized command, Augustus eliminated the constant threat of civil war. Soldiers no longer followed competing generals. They followed the state, embodied by one man. Loyalty shifted again, this time away from individuals toward an institution carefully shaped around Augustus himself. The Republic's old nightmare, armies marching on Rome, was ended by imperial discipline. Administration followed suit. Provinces were divided between those governed by the Senate and those under Augustus's direct control. In theory, this preserved republican authority. In practice, the most important and militarized regions answered only to him. Wealth, force, and decision-making converged at the center. Rome had not regained its republic. It had refined its submission. Yet this submission was welcomed. The long years of war had exhausted Rome's appetite for political participation. Citizens valued stability more than debate. Order mattered more than representation. Augustus delivered results where institutions had failed. Roads were maintained. Grain flowed reliably. Justice became predictable. For most Romans, daily life improved. Peace, the Pax Romana, was not merely absence of war, but it was psychological relief. Under Augustus, Rome experienced a profound shift in values. Civic competition gave way to hierarchy. Public ambition narrowed. The dangerous energies that once fueled the Republic were redirected into service, loyalty, and cultural achievement. Poetry, architecture, and history flourished under imperial patronage, celebrating Rome's destiny and continuity. The Republic became myth. Its stories were preserved, idealized, and taught, but no longer practiced. Roman children learned of consuls, tribunes, and assemblies as symbols of greatness, not instruments of power. The past was honored precisely because it no longer threatened the present. This was Augustus's greatest achievement. He transformed a failed system into a moral foundation for empire. By preserving the Republic's language, he prevented resistance. By honoring its memory, he neutralized its return. Yet beneath this success lay a final truth. The Republic had not been wrong in principle. It had been overwhelmed by scale. A system designed to govern a city and its hinterland could not sustain control over a Mediterranean empire. The Republic had been too successful for its own design. Augustus did not correct this mismatch. He resolved it by ending the experiment. The Senate remained, but it governed within limits set by the emperor. Law remained, but it flowed from imperial authority. Citizenship expanded, but loyalty was expected in return. Rome's political life stabilized, but at the cost of genuine self-rule. The transformation was so complete that many barely noticed it happening. There was no final vote abolishing the Republic, no declaration of empire, only gradual acceptance that authority no longer emerged from collective decision, but from centralized command. And Rome accepted it because it worked. For nearly 5 centuries, the Republic had struggled, adapted, and endured. It had built Rome's greatness and revealed its limits. Augustus closed that chapter not with destruction, but with absorption. The Republic survived as memory. The empire lived as reality. And as Rome entered an age of peace unmatched in its history, the cost of that peace faded into the background, visible only to those who remembered what had been lost. With Augustus firmly at the center of Roman life, the transformation was complete, not announced, not celebrated, but accepted. The Republic did not end with a proclamation. It ended with a realization that Rome no longer needed it to function. The ancient experiment in shared governance had given way to something more stable, more durable, and ultimately more suited to the scale Rome had reached. The empire did not erase the Republic's achievements. It inherited them. Roman law continued to evolve, refined by jurists who built upon centuries of republican precedent. Concepts of citizenship expanded far beyond anything the early Republic had imagined, binding diverse peoples into a shared legal identity. Administration grew more systematic. Governance became predictable. The state, once dependent on the character of individuals, now rested on enduring structures, bureaucratic, military, and legal. In this sense, the Republic did not fail. It transformed. Its erosion had been gradual because its success demanded it. A system built to prevent kingship had conquered too much territory, commanded too many armies, and governed too many peoples to remain intact. The Republic had stretched itself beyond its limits, adapting repeatedly until adaptation became abandonment. Augustus recognized this reality with clarity few before him had possessed. He did not claim to be Rome's savior. He claimed to be its steward. His authority was framed as custodial, protecting traditions rather than replacing them. This framing mattered. It allowed Romans to see continuity rather than rupture. The Republic lived on as an ideal, a moral compass, even as it ceased to exist as a governing force. This duality defined Rome's imperial identity. Romans could honor their past without returning to it. They could celebrate liberty while accepting authority. They could remember the Republic as a golden age without demanding its restoration. The contradiction was not resolved, it was absorbed. For generations, this balance held. The empire delivered what the Republic could no longer guarantee: peace without perpetual civil war. Borders stabilized, commerce flourished, Culture expanded. Rome reached heights of influence and longevity unimaginable to its founders. The cost, political participation, was real, but increasingly abstract to citizens who had never known stability under the old system. And yet, the Republic's legacy endured in quieter ways. The idea that power should be justified, not merely seized. That law should bind rulers as well as ruled. That citizenship carried rights as well as duties. These concepts, forged in the Republic's long struggle, survived the transition. They shaped imperial governance. They influenced later civilizations that looked to Rome not only as an empire, but as a model. Long after emperors replaced consuls, Roman law would guide courts across Europe. Republican ideas of representation, checks on power, and civic duty would resurface in moments of political rebirth centuries later. The Republic's failure to govern an empire did not erase its contribution to human history. It clarified it. The Roman Republic was never meant to be eternal. It was an experiment, bold, resilient, and imperfect. It confronted power with restraint, ambition with suspicion, and authority with law. For nearly 5 centuries, it endured against odds that would have destroyed lesser systems. Its end was not a condemnation. It was a consequence. Rome's greatest achievement was not empire alone, but the ideas it carried forward. Ideas tested by conflict, refined by crisis, and preserved even as institutions fell away. The Republic taught the world that power could be limited, debated, and justified. The empire taught the world that order could be maintained at scale. Together, they formed a legacy unmatched in antiquity. When Augustus died, Rome mourned not a king, but a guardian of peace. The republic he claimed to restore was gone, but its memory remained powerful enough to legitimize centuries of rule. That memory became Rome's conscience, invoked whenever authority drifted too far from justice. In this way, the republic never truly vanished. It became Rome's shadow, present in law, in language, in ideals whispered beneath imperial command. And perhaps that is its final lesson, that no system dies completely while its ideas endure. That even in surrendering power, a civilization can shape the future. That the Roman Republic, though transformed beyond recognition, achieved something rarer than permanence. It achieved relevance beyond its own time. Thus ended the Republic, not with collapse or conquest, but with transformation, leaving behind an empire to rule the world and ideas strong enough to outlive it.